In the shadows of Scripture, where ancient voices still echo, there lies a tension that unsettles both heart and mind. The Bible tells of Samson, a man born with impossible strength, a Nazarite set apart from the womb, whose very hair carried the secret of his covenant with God. Yet the Quran is silent on his name, and many wonder why a figure so mighty, so tragic, is not placed among the prophets of Islam. Could it be that his story is not what it seems? Could it be that his downfall was not a testimony of faith, but a warning about something far deeper? The conflict between texts begins even before Samson's birth. In the Bible, the angel visits his mother, declaring that the boy shall never taste wine nor touch impurity, for his hair will be the seal of his strength. But in Islam, strength is never found in strands of hair or rituals of flesh. It is Allah who grants and withdraws power. So why does one tradition tie holiness to physical locks, while the other dismisses such notions as superstition? Was this a true covenant, or a metaphor misunderstood by later hands? And what of his lust for Philistine women? The Bible does not veil his weakness. It lays bare his hunger, his anger, his pride. A man chosen as Israel's judge, yet falling into the arms of Delilah, a woman who would trade kisses for coins. In Christianity, Samson is often painted as both hero and failure, a riddle of contradictions. But Islam does not speak of prophets being trapped by lust or blinded by women, for the prophets in the Quran are preserved from such sins. So if Samson was indeed chosen, how could he fall so low? Was he ever truly chosen, or was his story altered to reflect Israel's struggle rather than God's will? The questions ripple outward. When Samson placed his hands on the pillars of Gaza, when he cried out to God one final time, when the house collapsed and thousands perished, was this divine justice or desperate suicide? The Bible frames it as a victory of faith, but Islam rejects the idea that God glorifies suicide or death as deliverance. In Islam, the martyr dies defending truth, not crushing his enemies in vengeance. So which is true? Was Samson a martyr, or merely a broken man begging for one last taste of power before the end? This same conflict bleeds into other stories. If Isaac was the promised son in the Bible, why does the Quran hint that Ishmael was the one tested upon the altar? If Jesus died upon the cross in Christian faith, why does Islam insist he was raised, untouched by crucifixion? If the Trinity is central to Christian belief, why is the word itself never written in the Bible's pages? And if books like Enoch once walked hand in hand with Scripture, why were they cast aside, hidden, declared apocryphal? Who chose which stories would remain and which would be buried? The tale of Samson, then, becomes more than one man's tragedy. It becomes a mirror reflecting how faiths diverge, how one sees God's chosen fall into sin, while the other insists God's chosen never fall. It raises the haunting question: do we believe in a God who binds power to hair and vengeance, or a God who gives strength only to serve truth without flaw? And as you close your eyes and let this story unfold, you will find yourself torn between two worlds. One where Samson's death is hailed as triumph, and one where such an end could never be from God. But what if these stories were never meant to agree? Long before the birth of Samson, the people of Israel lived under the heavy hand of the Philistines. Their cries rose to heaven, weary of oppression, weary of their enemies mocking their weakness. It is in this silence of despair that the angel of the Lord is said to have descended, not to a mighty priest or a seasoned warrior, but to a barren woman whose womb had known no child. The messenger declared that she would bear a son not ordinary, but consecrated before birth. He would be a Nazarite, one who must never drink wine, never touch impurity, and never let a razor touch his hair. His strength would not be like that of ordinary men, for God himself would rest upon him, and he would begin to deliver Israel from its oppressors. Thus, the child was marked not by the will of man, but by divine decree, and his mother trembled at the responsibility laid upon her. When Samson was born, the land rejoiced, yet even in his youth, his presence unsettled those around him. He was unlike the other children. His arms carried the weight of iron as though it were straw. His steps thundered upon the earth, and his eyes seemed to burn with the fire of something beyond mortal strength. He grew under the shadow of the vow, his locks untouched, his hands restless, his heart restless. The Bible paints him as chosen, but also as impulsive, a man of passions and fierce desires. And so the paradox began, the strongest man in Israel, yet the weakest in the face of temptation. It was on a journey to claim a bride from among the Philistines that Samson first encountered the lion. The scriptures say he walked through the vineyards of Timnah when a young lion roared against him. In that moment, no sword was in his hand, no bow, no spear. Yet the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent the beast as one tears a young goat. The earth drank the blood of the lion, and the man walked away with nothing but silence on his lips. He told no one, not even his parents, for the mystery of his strength was his alone to carry. Days later, when he passed by the same place, he found in the carcass of the lion a swarm of bees and honey. He tasted its sweetness, and from it he drew a riddle that would become the snare of his enemies. Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. The wedding feast that followed was filled with laughter, with wine, with wagers. Samson, bold and reckless, gave the Philistines his riddle, and for days they struggled, for the answer lay hidden in the secret of his strength. But when his bride, pressed by her own people, coaxed the answer from him, the Philistines triumphed. His heart burned with rage, for betrayal had tasted sweeter than honey and then turned bitter upon his tongue. To pay the debt of his lost wager, he struck down 30 men, stripped them of their garments, and delivered them as payment. Thus, the story of Samson begins not with peace, but with violence, not with wisdom, but with anger, and his path became one of blood and vengeance. The Bible does not shy away from his contradictions. He was a judge of Israel, yet a man who sought Philistine women. He was consecrated by vow, yet reckless with its sacredness. His strength was divine, yet his choices human. This duality haunted his every step, as though he were both servant and rebel, chosen and cursed. The lion he killed became the mirror of his own soul, fierce, untamed, and doomed to fall because of its own power. But when this story is weighed against the Quran and the teachings of Islam, silence surrounds the figure of Samson. Nowhere in the Quran is his name spoken. No verse recounts the slaying of the lion, the honey in the carcass, or the riddle at the feast. Yet Islam does not deny that many men of Israel rose as judges, nor that God gave strength to whom he willed. Instead, the Islamic view places a veil over men like Samson, suggesting perhaps that their lives were lessons in failure rather than prophecy. In Islam, true prophets are never enslaved by lust, never trapped by anger, never careless with the covenant of God. They are models of righteousness, preserved from sin so that none may doubt their example. Samson, then, becomes for Islam not a prophet, but a man whom God allowed to rise for a time, only to fall because of his own weakness. This difference strikes deep at the heart of faith. For in Christianity, Samson can be seen as a warning and yet a hero, a sinner and yet anointed, a man who fell yet fulfilled God's purpose even in death. His contradictions are embraced as part of a larger mystery, that God works even through broken vessels. But in Islam, such a picture is unworthy of a prophet. A man who lies, who lusts, who kills in anger, how can he lead the people of God? The Quran shields its prophets from such flaws, insisting that divine messengers reflect divine guidance without corruption. This is where the two traditions part, and the story takes on entirely different meanings. If Samson's strength lay in his hair, was it truly God's power, or was it a superstition born from human imagination? If his fall came through the lips of a woman, was this divine will, or simply the weakness of a man who could not govern his heart? And if his triumph came in death, pulling down the pillars of Gaza, was this the act of a martyr, or of one who could not see another way? Christianity clings to him as both hero and caution, while Islam leaves him in silence, neither raising him to prophecy nor condemning him outright. The question that remains is unsettling. For if one tradition praises his death as victory, and another rejects the very idea that God would glorify such an end, then what does it mean for us who read these stories centuries later? Should we see Samson as God's instrument or as man's warning? Should we believe that holiness can rest in hair, or must we see such details as remnants of myth woven into scripture? And if Islam is right, that prophets are sinless and unbroken, then what does Samson's story truly teach us about God and his ways with mankind? So the riddle remains unsolved. Out of the eater came forth meat, out of the strong came forth sweetness. But what sweetness is found in contradiction? What meat is drawn from confusion? One faith proclaims him judge and deliverer, another leaves him unmentioned, and we are left staring at the carcass of the tale, searching for honey that may or may not exist. The tale of Samson grows darker as the years pass, for strength that once astonished Israel began to bend beneath the weight of desire. After his early victories against the Philistines, after the lion and the riddle and the sudden bursts of violence, Samson's life turned increasingly toward women who did not share his covenant, women who were of the very people he was raised to oppose. The scriptures tell us that among the valleys of Sorek there lived a woman named Delilah, whose beauty captured his heart. It was not the first time he loved a Philistine woman, nor would it be the last time his passion betrayed him, but in Delilah the story would find its breaking point. Samson, who could tear lions and gates, could not guard his own heart against the whisper of a woman's affection. The Philistine lords, weary of the destruction Samson brought upon them, saw in Delilah an opportunity. They promised her silver if she would discover the secret of his strength, that mysterious power which no sword could conquer. At first her words came as gentle inquiry, the innocent curiosity of a lover. She asked where his strength lay, and Samson, playing with her, offered false answers. He told her that if he were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would become weak like other men. The Philistines tried it, but when they came upon him, Samson tore the cords as if they were thread. Again Delilah pressed him, and again he deceived her, speaking of ropes never used before, and later of weaving the locks of his hair into a loom. Each time the Philistines came, each time Samson rose in power, scattering them like chaff before the wind. Yet Delilah did not relent. Her voice was persistent, her embrace intoxicating, and Samson, blinded by desire, remained at her side though her betrayal was plain. Day after day she pressed him until his soul was vexed unto death. Finally, worn down, weary of her persistence, he opened his heart to her and revealed the truth. From his mother's womb, he said, he had been a Nazarite to God. No razor had touched his head, for his hair was the sign of his consecration. If his locks were cut, his vow would be broken and his strength would leave him. In that moment of weakness, Delilah knew she had triumphed. She sent word to the Philistine lords, and with silver weighing her hands, she lulled Samson to sleep upon her lap. As he lay in slumber, a man shaved the 7 locks of his head, and the covenant that had marked him was severed. When he awoke, the Philistines rushed upon him, and he rose to shake them off as before, but the scripture whispers with sorrow, he knew not that the Lord had departed from him. His arms, once like iron, trembled with weakness. His eyes, once blazing with fire, saw only the fists of his enemies. They seized him, gouged out his eyes, and bound him with bronze shackles, forcing him to grind grain in the prison house of Gaza. Thus the judge of Israel became a slave, the strongest of men reduced to blindness and humiliation. His story is painted as a tragedy of betrayal, where love became the snare of death. Yet the Bible also casts it as a tale of providence, for through his fall, God would prepare a final act of vengeance upon the Philistines. His hair, though shorn, would begin to grow again. His strength, though withdrawn, would one day return. But between the lines lies the haunting truth that Samson's downfall came not by the sword of enemies, but by the lips of one he loved. The lion could not kill him, the Philistine armies could not subdue him, yet Delilah, with her persistence and her betrayal, accomplished what armies could not. The strong was broken by the tender, the warrior by the lover, the judge by his own heart. In the Islamic lens, the silence around Samson grows louder here. The Quran does not tell this story, nor does it describe a prophet falling into such weakness. To Muslims, prophets are not betrayed in this way, nor do they reveal the secrets of God's covenant to their enemies through the whisper of a woman's lap. In Islam, such a tale does not belong among the examples of God's chosen, for prophets in the Quran are protected from these entanglements. They are not slaves to passion, nor do they fall into snares of lust. Their mission is too pure, their calling too guarded by divine will to allow for such compromise. Thus, Samson's story is seen by many Islamic scholars as a tale of a man of Israel, a judge, perhaps even blessed for a time, but not a prophet, not one chosen to guide the people in truth. His betrayal, then, becomes a moral lesson, not a prophetic account. The difference is profound. In Christianity, Samson's weakness is embraced as part of his humanity, a reminder that even the chosen can fall, and yet God can still bring victory through their brokenness. In Islam, such brokenness is unworthy of the prophetic office. A prophet cannot be deceived by lust, cannot be ensnared by betrayal, cannot be humiliated by enemies through such folly. The story of Delilah, therefore, stands at the crossroads of two faiths, one that sees God's purposes fulfilled even through the failures of his servants, and one that sees such failures as proof that Samson was never a prophet at all. And yet one cannot help but ask, if Samson was truly chosen of God, why was he abandoned when his hair was cut? Was power so shallow that it could rest in strands upon the head? Or was the hair merely a symbol, and the true strength always God's alone, withdrawn when Samson betrayed his calling? And deeper still, if God allowed him to be betrayed, if God allowed his eyes to be gouged and his body enslaved, then was Samson a vessel of glory or of warning? Was his love for Delilah his downfall, or was Delilah herself an instrument chosen to bring him low, so that his final act would bring greater destruction upon Israel's enemies? Here, Christianity and Islam whisper in opposition. The Bible proclaims that Samson's death would bring greater deliverance than his life. Islam insists that God's chosen do not need to fall in order to be victorious. Christianity finds in his weakness a mirror of all humanity in need of redemption, often failing yet still part of God's story. Islam finds in his failure evidence that he was not among the ranks of true prophets, for God does not entrust his message to those enslaved by passion. And so the riddle deepens. If Samson was betrayed by love, then what does this teach us about the love of God? If his strength could be bought with silver and lost with a razor, what does this teach us about divine power? If the story of Delilah is one of the Bible's warnings, then Islam asks why such a tale is not fitting for the purity of prophecy. And if Christianity holds it as a sign that even broken men can be used by God, then are we to accept that failure itself can be sanctified? The figure of Delilah lingers as both villain and mirror. She is remembered as the one who brought down a judge, yet she is also the reminder that strength without discipline, calling without purity, is fragile as thread. In her lap Samson found comfort, but in her lap he also found the end of his strength. And we who listen are left to wonder whether this story is a divine parable or a human tragedy written into holy text. For if one faith embraces his downfall as part of God's plan, and the other denies that a prophet could ever fall so low, then who holds the truth? Was Samson a judge blessed with strength, but doomed by weakness? Or was his story reshaped by hands that sought to explain Israel's struggles through a flawed hero? And if prophets must be sinless to guide mankind, then what becomes of Samson's tale in the light of eternity? The story of Samson, once crowned with the fire of divine strength, narrows now to its most tragic and unforgettable scene. The man who had once torn lions with his bare hands, who had carried city gates upon his shoulders, who had struck down armies with the jawbone of a donkey, was now reduced to blindness and humiliation. The Philistines, rejoicing over their victory, paraded him like a trophy of conquest. His eyes, gouged out by their cruelty, saw nothing but endless night. His hands, once instruments of impossible power, were bound to the grinding wheel of a prison. The judge of Israel had become a slave, mocked by his enemies, forgotten by those he once delivered. Yet in the silence of that prison, in the darkness behind his sightless eyes, a slow and patient miracle began. The locks of his hair, severed by betrayal, began to grow again. Each strand whispered that his vow, though broken, was not utterly erased, and though his strength had left him, it might one day return. The Philistine lords, gloating in triumph, declared a festival to Dagon, their god of grain and fertility. They filled the great temple of Gaza with men and women, with nobles and commoners, with music and laughter. Upon the high platform, the lords raised their voices, praising their god for delivering Samson into their hands. They saw his blindness as proof that their idol was greater than the God of Israel. They reveled in their triumph, drunk with pride, deaf to the thunder of divine justice gathering in silence. To complete their mockery, they summoned Samson from the prison, forcing him to entertain them. Led by the hand of a boy, the once mighty man was paraded into the temple, his humiliation the centerpiece of their festival. They jeered at him, they spat upon him, they laughed at the fall of Israel's champion. It is here that the story finds its final tension. The blind man stood within the temple, surrounded by thousands who scorned him, his ears filled with laughter, his body weakened by chains. But within his chest burned one last ember of faith, one last cry that could not be silenced. Samson asked the boy who guided him to place his hands upon the pillars that upheld the temple. His fingers traced the cold stone, feeling the weight of the structure, the lives of thousands balanced upon its strength. And in that moment, Samson prayed, not for life, not for freedom, but for vengeance. His words, etched in sorrow, echoed into eternity. O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me. I pray thee only this once, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. With those words, he bowed himself with all his might, pressing against the pillars, and the temple began to tremble. Stones cracked, timbers groaned, cries of fear rose above the laughter. In one final act, Samson pulled the house down upon himself and his enemies, killing more in his death than he had slain in his life. The Bible closes this chapter with a paradox. The man who was born to deliver Israel achieved his greatest victory not in the strength of his life, but in the surrender of his death. His story becomes one of sacrifice, of flawed faith redeemed in final obedience. Yet the sacrifice is not without troubling questions. Samson's last act was not to save his people, but to destroy his enemies. His final prayer was not for Israel's deliverance, but for personal vengeance. The scriptures record that God granted him strength one last time, and the temple fell, but readers are left to wrestle with what kind of victory this truly was. Was it deliverance, or was it despair cloaked in divine response? Islam looks upon this story with silence, and the silence itself is its commentary. Nowhere in the Quran does a prophet cry for vengeance in death. Nowhere is suicide or destruction of oneself praised as divine victory. In Islam, life is sacred, and to take one's own life is to sin against the trust of God. A martyr in Islam does not seek vengeance for personal wounds. He dies defending truth, faith, and the innocent. The Quran raises prophets as examples of patience and endurance, not as men who end their lives in wrath. Thus, the story of Samson's death does not fit within the Islamic framework of prophecy. A man who dies crushing his enemies in vengeance cannot be an exemplar of divine guidance. The silence of Islam towards Samson is perhaps a mercy, sparing the faithful from a story that confuses martyrdom with suicide, justice with revenge. This contrast opens a wound between the two traditions. In Christianity, Samson's final act can be seen as a shadow of the cross, a man who in death brings deliverance, his arms stretched wide as he embraces both destruction and triumph. Some Christian interpreters see in him a flawed symbol of Christ, a man who died so that his people might live. But in Islam, this comparison is unthinkable, for prophets are preserved from such flaws, and God does not glorify death through self-destruction. Instead, the Islamic vision of deliverance rests upon submission, patience, and truth, not upon collapsing temples and cries of vengeance. And so the story of Samson ends as it began, in contradiction. Was his strength truly from God, or was it a legend born of myth? Was his death a victory, or was it the final failure of a man who could not master his own heart? If his prayer was answered, does that mean God honored vengeance? And if Islam is right to keep silence, then why does the Bible preserve this tale of violence and tragedy as part of sacred history? The riddle of Samson remains unresolved. For us who listen, the challenge is sharp. If the Bible calls this victory and the Quran would never call it prophecy, then which voice tells the truth? Is holiness found in vengeance or in forgiveness, in self-destruction or in endurance? In Samson's fall, we see both the height of strength and the depth of weakness, both faith's triumph and humanity's despair. But if prophets are meant to lead us to God, then can a blind man crushing his enemies be the model we are to follow? Or is his story not that of a prophet at all, but of a warning, a tale written so that we may never mistake strength for righteousness, or vengeance for victory. The name Delilah rises like a shadow over the story of Samson, and even centuries later her figure lingers as both fascination and warning. In the biblical account, she is introduced not as an enemy warrior, not as a prophetess, nor even as a queen, but simply as a woman of the valley of Sorek. She had no crown upon her head, no army at her back, and yet she brought about the downfall of the strongest man Israel had ever known. Her weapon was not the sword, but affection. Her strategy was not conquest, but persistence. The scriptures unfold their drama slowly, showing how Samson, judge of Israel, walked willingly into her arms, choosing desire over discipline and passion over the covenant of his God. The Philistine lords, searching for a way to subdue Samson, saw Delilah as their chance. They promised her silver, an amount vast enough to secure her loyalty, if only she could uncover the source of his strength. Here the tension of the story grows. Samson, who had withstood armies, who had scattered warriors, who had defied death itself, now lay in the lap of a single woman. She began her work not with threats, but with questions, spoken in the tender voice of intimacy. Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. The request itself revealed her intent, yet Samson, whether blinded by love or convinced of his invincibility, did not leave her side. 3 times he gave her false answers. First, he said that 7 fresh bowstrings would subdue him, and she tested it, binding him in his sleep. But when the Philistines rushed in, Samson broke them as if they were threads burned in fire. Then he told her that new ropes, never before used, would hold him. Again she tried, and again he shattered them like threads. A 3rd time he told her to weave his 7 locks into the loom, and when the Philistines came, he rose with the loom itself upon his head. Each time the pattern repeated. Delilah pressed, Samson resisted with deceit, the Philistines attacked, and Samson triumphed. Yet instead of fleeing from her obvious betrayal, he stayed, ensnared by something deeper than strength could resist. The Bible describes her persistence with unflinching detail. Day after day she pressed him until his soul was vexed unto death. Worn down, weary of her endless appeals, he gave in. He told her the truth that no razor had touched his head, that his strength was bound to his vow as a Nazarite, consecrated to God from birth. If his hair were cut, his strength would depart, and he would become like other men. The words left his mouth, and with them left the last barrier protecting him from his enemies. Delilah knew she had finally broken him, and she wasted no time. She lulled him to sleep upon her lap, called for a man to shave his 7 locks, and then cried out, "The Philistines be upon thee, Samson." He awoke, thinking to rise as before, but the scripture mournfully declares, he knew not that the Lord had departed from him. The Philistines seized him at once. His arms no longer carried the fire of God, his body no longer burned with divine strength. They bound him with bronze fetters, gouged out his eyes, and carried him to Gaza. There they set him to grinding grain like an ox. His strength turned to humiliation, his sight turned to darkness. The once mighty judge of Israel was reduced to a blind slave, mocked by his enemies. The betrayal of Delilah was complete, not only because she sold him for silver, but because she had stripped away the secret of his consecration, the symbol of his covenant with God. Her kisses hid the knife, her embrace hid the chains, and Samson, who had conquered beasts and armies, fell because he could not conquer his own desires. When this story is viewed through the eyes of Islam, a veil of silence falls. The Quran does not name Delilah, nor does it recount her betrayal. The very absence of such a tale reflects a fundamental difference between the two traditions. In Islam, prophets are preserved from sins of lust and betrayal, shielded by divine protection so that their example remains untarnished. A prophet cannot be tricked by a lover into revealing God's secrets. A prophet cannot lie in the lap of temptation and lose his strength to passion. Thus, the Islamic tradition does not recognize Samson as a prophet. At best, he may be considered a figure of Israel's history, a man of extraordinary strength who lived and died with flaws too deep for prophetic office. The silence is itself a judgment, for in Islam betrayal of this kind does not belong in the lives of those chosen to guide mankind. This difference challenges the heart of interpretation. In Christianity, Samson's fall is embraced as a lesson of weakness, a reminder that even the chosen can stumble, and yet God's purposes can still prevail. The betrayal of Delilah becomes a warning of the dangers of desire, the fragility of strength without obedience, and the cost of compromising with sin. But in Islam, such a story would undermine the purity of prophetic example. The prophets of the Quran are lights without shadow, leaders who embody obedience and purity. To portray one as betrayed by passion would suggest that God's message could be corrupted, and this is unthinkable in Islamic faith. So where does this leave the story of Delilah? If the Bible records her betrayal as sacred history, while Islam excludes it altogether, then which is true? Was Samson truly chosen of God, or was he only a flawed judge elevated for a time? Was Delilah the tool of divine justice, or merely the temptress of human weakness? And if God allowed his chosen to fall by the hand of a woman, what does that mean for our understanding of holiness and strength? The tension between these traditions presses into deeper questions. If prophets can sin and fall, as in the Bible, then how can they be trusted as guides? But if prophets cannot sin, as in the Quran, then why does the Bible preserve stories that show their flaws? Which vision of God's messengers reflects the true will of heaven? Delilah's silver clinks through history, her betrayal echoing in every retelling, forcing us to ask whether strength is ever safe in the hands of passion, whether holiness can be undone by desire, whether faith can survive betrayal. Her story is not just about Samson, nor about one woman in Sorek. It is about the conflict between human weakness and divine purpose, about whether God's chosen may stumble and yet still fulfill his plan. It is about whether betrayal is part of the story of salvation, or whether such stories reveal the hand of men, not the hand of God. And so we are left with questions as haunting as Samson's blindness. If the Bible calls her betrayal sacred and Islam leaves her unnamed, then where do we find the truth? In Delilah's lap or in the silence of the Quran? In Samson's fall or in the rejection of such a tale? The betrayal of Delilah forces us to ask not only what Samson lost, but what we believe God demands from those he chooses to lead. Delilah entered the story like a quiet river, shallow at the edge and deep at the heart. She was not born with a crown, and she did not command battalions, yet she understood the tides that move men better than many kings. In the valley of Sorek, her name traveled on whispered breath, and Samson followed that whisper as if it were a summons. He was a judge of Israel, heavy with a vow older than his own memory, and still he drifted toward her door as though the angelic words that had framed his childhood belonged to someone else. He had lifted gates, torn lions, scattered armies, but before Delilah, he chose to set aside the sword of vigilance and rest his head where questions were more dangerous than spears. The lords of the Philistines watched as hunters watch a wounded stag. They knew that no company of soldiers could hold him, no iron could weigh his arms, so they brought an offer that would weigh another heart. Silver spills easily when fear must be purchased, and fear was everywhere. The lords promised a price, and Delilah heard it. She did not storm the hills with chariots. She learned a different battle. She asked the kind of question that opens a door in the soul and leaves it unlocked. "Tell me where your strength lies," she said, not as an interrogator, but as a lover asking what melody a heart is tuned to. The question was a cup sweetened with intimacy, and Samson drank from it. He lied first, and the lie was a game that should have ended the night it began. "7 green cords," he said, "and I will be as any man." She bound him while he slept and summoned the hidden men at the door. The cords snapped like breathing reeds. The game should have ended, but he did not walk away. He remained, and the second lie soon followed. New ropes never yet used. The same pattern returned with almost ritual clarity. Sleep binding, a cry, Philistine footsteps, and the sound of bonds ripping like wet thread. A third time came with a strange closeness to truth. "Weave my 7 locks into the loom." He rose with the beam on his head, a man wearing the machinery of his own temptation like a crown of wood. The house must have been filled with a confusion of laughter and fear, the kind that follows a failed ambush where everyone pretends they were only joking. Day after day she pressed him, and the scripture draws its breath long when it says that his soul was vexed unto death. Words can carve channels deeper than swords. He had slain with the jawbone of a donkey, and yet he could not silence one voice, could not close one door in his own heart. A vow had guarded his head since he was a child, a vow he had been taught before he had learned his own name, and he carried that vow like a burning seal. At last he opened the seal. "A Nazarite from the womb," he whispered, "no razor has touched my head, for the hair is the sign of the consecration. Cut it, and the strength that visits me will depart." The secret left his chest and entered her hands as if it were coin, bright and heavy, bought and sold in a moment. She lulled him to sleep upon her lap. The verb is a soft river that carries mountains. While he slept, a man came and shaved the 7 locks, each lock a strand of remembered commands, each curl a fragment of a promise his mother had guarded with careful meals and careful prayers. Delilah cried out the old alarm, "The Philistines are upon you," and he rose with the echo of old victories in his ears. He shook himself as men shake off nightmares. He reached for a sun that had always risen in his blood and found only night. He did not know the Lord had departed. Hands that had felt like pillars felt like reeds. Fists that had been hammers found the soft limits of flesh. They bound him with bronze. They took his sight. They led him to a wheel, and he turned it like an animal treading a circle that ends where it begins. The story of Delilah does not end when the razor is lifted. It continues with the deep ache of what remains after strength leaves. Samson had time to think while grinding grain in Gaza. The rhythm of the wheel is the most ancient teacher. Around, and every circle asks the same question. What is strength when the heart bows to a whisper? He had time to remember the angel at his mother's door, the kitchen where she measured water and flour with a reverence that children misread, the first time he was told not to touch the dead, not to drink the pressed sweetness, not to break the covenant that clothed his head. He had time to remember honey in the carcass of a lion, to taste again the sweetness that grew from a riddle and became his lifelong parable. The eater gives meat, the strong gives sweetness. He had mistaken the parable. The eater was not the world, it was himself. The sweetness would be drawn not from his victories, but from what survived after his strength was taken. What of Delilah during these turnings of the wheel? The text is thinner here. We are left with motives that can hold many colors. Perhaps she feared the lords who paid her. Perhaps she loved Samson in that tangled way that seeks safety before truth. Perhaps she was a patriot in a season of war where every choice is a wound. Perhaps she was simply greedy. The silver clinked, whether as ransom or payment or seal. In the end, the story does not excuse her, and it does not curse her alone. It holds the mirror so that both faces are seen, the hand that shaved and the head that slept. Betrayal is never built by one heart. It is a table set by two, one laying the knife, the other lying upon it. The Bible does not bury women in blame, though many readers try. Delilah stands beside other women whose names carry the weight of turning points. There is Yael with her tent stake, and Ruth with her gleaned faith, and Hannah with her vow. There is a tapestry here, not a single thread, and Delilah's thread is made of questions that will not leave the soul alone. How do we hold a vow when a voice asks for what the vow protects? How do we sustain strength when desire keeps opening the window? How do we read love when love speaks like a riddle with a price at the end? Samson's defeat at Sorek was not a surprise to anyone who watched his earlier roads. Passion had long been the small fox in his vineyard, the quiet ruin in a life that thundered. The Nazirite vow was the string that held his fragments together. No wine, no touch of the dead, no blade upon the head. In another man, that vow would be offense. In Samson, it became a story men told instead of a discipline he practiced. He ate honey from a carcass, he threw feasts where wine laughed, he touched bones and he touched danger, and still he woke to strength because mercy is patient. Mercy allows seasons where consequences seem to sleep, but the harvest arrives. The harvest always arrives. When the razor sang its simple song and the hair fell, consequence took its hand back from patience. In prison, his hair began to grow again. Here the narrative lifts a quiet corner of hope. The sign returns before the power returns. The outward token rises in silence before anything changes in the heart. It is a mercy too, not the mercy of triumph, but the mercy that sets a man in a small classroom and hands him the alphabet again. He would learn to pray in the dark. He would learn to remember in the absence of noise. He would learn to ask for what could be asked with empty hands. Now the Islamic gaze enters and the room changes. In the Quran, the prophets are preserved from this theater of failure. They are guarded by a protection that keeps the message clean. The word for this guarding is often named with a dignity that says the messengers are not toyed with by lust or felled by the lap of a trickster. A prophet may face slander. A prophet may be accused. A prophet may be punished by tyrants, but the prophet does not barter away a covenant in a bedroom. Islam listens to the tale of Delilah and does not place it upon the shoulders of prophecy. It moves the story to the shelves where kings and judges and ordinary men keep their cautionary songs. There is a different gallery of women in the Islamic memory. There is Mary, honored above many, a sign of purity and wonder. There is the wife of the Pharaoh who softened a tyrant's house for an infant. There is the story of the righteous who are defended by God not by flirting victories, but by steadfast truth. There is also the story of a woman who tempted Joseph, and in that story the prophet does not fall. He chooses the prison over the bed. The doors open, and he runs toward them, and when the doors lock, he runs toward God with the same speed. Islam tells the lesson from the point of view of protection. It builds the idea that guidance cannot be mixed with surrender to desire, and that the teacher must not fall where the student is asked to stand. In this light, Delilah cannot belong to prophecy. Her role would distort the very hope prophecy must provide. This is not to deny the gravity of temptation or the reality of betrayal. Islam speaks strongly about guarding the heart, about modesty, about the discipline that lowers the gaze and lifts the intention, about the way private rooms can become battlefields if the soul is unarmed. It agrees with the Bible that desire is a river that can drown a city, but it disagrees that a messenger of God can be swept away by that flood. So the silence over Samson in the Quran becomes an argument by absence. Where a prophet stands, this kind of story does not stand with him. Where guidance must be trusted, the guide is protected. Here the interfaith challenge rises like a slow tide that eventually reaches every doorstep. If the hair of Samson carried the sign of his covenant, was that sign a vessel or a superstition? If the holy power can be cut by a razor, is the holiness in the body or in the one who gives and takes? If the strongest man in the book must fall into betrayal in order to become an instrument again, what does that teach a child who is learning the words of faith? If the final victory must ride inside a death that he chooses with his own hands, what message walks out of the temple and into the streets? Islam asks whether the message of holiness can be taught by a story in which a man who is set apart allows his vows to become riddles in a lover's mouth. Christianity asks whether holiness can be understood without the ache of human weakness standing in the middle of it. Islam points to Joseph and Mary and to the guarded lives of messengers and says that God does not place the light inside a lantern full of cracks. Christianity points to the long line of broken servants through whom God still worked and says that grace can pour through broken edges. The two turn the same coin and see different faces. Delilah remains on the page, not as an emblem of womanhood, but as a sign that love without truth becomes a net. The lovers of truth do not purchase confidence with silver. The lovers of strength do not take sleep as permission to lift a blade. Her name should be spoken with care, for whenever it is used to condemn women, it becomes another knife. The story indicts a system of desire and a man who chose to silence a vow because a voice was tender. It indicts the lords who paid for a secret that was never theirs to hold. It indicts a community that had long allowed its judge to live like a storm without a harbor. So the question stands at the door, the way the boy once led a blind man to the pillars. Is a faith truer when it allows its heroes to break and still be used, or when it refuses to seat a breaker among its heroes? Is power spiritual when it leans on symbols, or does it become spiritual only when symbols bow to the giver? If the Bible tells us that the strongest fell and God still wrote a strange victory, shall we read that as comfort or caution? If the Quran remains silent and keeps prophets in a circle of guarded dignity, shall we read that as protection or distance? A final thought is needed before the wheel stops turning. Betrayal thrives wherever desire promises safety without obedience. Whether a believer sits with the Bible open or the Quran open, the warning is the same. Locks can be beautiful and still be dangerous. Questions can be soft and still be swords. The heart must learn to say that a vow is not a riddle, that a covenant is not a story to share in the warm evening when lamps are low. If we are to learn from Samson, we must learn before the razor sings. If we are to learn from Islam's silence, we must learn that the messengers are protected because messages are fragile and people are easily lost. And now the challenge speaks in the quiet voice that all true challenges use. If strength can be shaved, was it ever more than a sign? If a covenant can be bought with silver, what have we taught about the value of the holy? If a victory can rise from a death chosen in vengeance, what have we taught about the sanctity of life? If a prophet must be clean to carry a clean word, what shall we call the man who sleeps where betrayal waits? Which story do we believe, and which story believes us. The valley of Sorek is not done with us. Its questions walk our streets and sit at our tables and ask for the secret of our strength. What will we say, and what will we refuse to say, and where will we lay our head when the night becomes warm and the voice becomes soft and the vow begins to sound like a riddle again? Samson's story narrows into the chamber of iron where defeat becomes teacher. The Philistines had cut his hair and taken his sight, had bound his wrists with bronze and mocked him before their crowds. A man who once walked with the authority of a judge now traced endless circles behind a millstone, blind as the ox beside him. His body bent under the monotony of grinding grain, his ears filled with laughter and scorn whenever passers-by wished to gloat over their prize. The lords of Gaza saw in him not only a man conquered, but a symbol that their god Dagon had triumphed over the God of Israel. For every turn of the wheel was a sermon in their temples, every clink of the fetters a hymn to their idols. Samson, the terror of Philistia, had become their living offering. Yet the scripture inserts a quiet detail easily overlooked but heavy with meaning. It says that while he labored in blindness, the hair on his head began to grow again. The strength did not return immediately. The chains did not fall away. The laughter of his enemies did not cease. But the silent symbol of his consecration began to rise once more. What does it mean for hair to grow in darkness? It is the language of hope speaking in small increments. The covenant he had betrayed was not entirely gone. The sign was not utterly erased. Even in humiliation, restoration was creeping back one strand at a time. Here is a paradox that the Bible often holds, that judgment and mercy walk hand in hand, that consequence and redemption breathe the same air. The lords of the Philistines decided to celebrate their apparent victory with a great feast. They gathered in the temple of Dagon, filling the house with thousands of men and women, with rulers and with common people, all eager to revel in triumph. Songs rose to the idol, incense curled through the air, laughter shook the stone pillars. The central theme of their celebration was not simply the worship of their God, but the humiliation of Israel's champion. They called for Samson to be brought out, not to fight, not to judge, but to entertain them. The blind man was led by a boy into the heart of the temple, where his very presence became a spectacle. They mocked his blindness, they jeered at his weakness, they exalted their idol for defeating the God of Israel. For the Philistines, Samson had become their most potent argument against the faith of his people. But inside Samson's heart, the silence of humiliation was breaking. He asked the boy to place his hands upon the pillars that held up the temple. His fingers searched the cold stone as if reading the secret of destiny written into its cracks. And there, in the midst of laughter, he prayed. The prayer of Samson is not long. It does not rise in poetic praise. It does not ask for forgiveness of sins. It is raw and direct. O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee only this once, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. His words carried vengeance, not mercy. They carried sorrow, not peace. Yet the scripture says God heard, and Samson bowed himself with all his might. The pillars trembled, the roof cracked, and the temple fell with a thunder that silenced laughter forever. In his death he slew more than he had slain in his life. His family later came to bury him between Zorah and Eshtaol, closing the life of a man whose story remained both victory and tragedy. The biblical lesson is complex. On the one hand, Samson's final act is seen as deliverance, an answer to Israel's oppression. His death brings defeat upon the Philistines, his humiliation turned into triumph. On the other hand, it is not the clean triumph of a prophet defending truth, but the messy vengeance of a broken man. The Bible does not erase his flaws, it does not whitewash his lust or his rage. Instead, it leaves us with a hero whose greatest victory was his last breath, whose strength returned only to bury him beneath the rubble. He is remembered as a judge, but not as a prophet. His name rests in the list of Israel's leaders, but always tinged with sorrow. His chains of bronze became prayers of iron, and in that collision, the temple collapsed. In the Islamic understanding, such an ending cannot belong to prophecy. The Quran offers no mention of Samson, and this silence speaks loudly. A prophet cannot pray for vengeance in death, cannot choose suicide as a final act, cannot glorify destruction of self as divine victory. In Islam, the prophets are upheld as models of patience, as bearers of truth, as teachers who endure but do not falter into wrathful despair. The Quran affirms martyrdom, but martyrdom is defined by defense of faith, not by the collapse of a pagan temple driven by personal anger. Islam protects its messengers from this image, for if prophets are guides, they must not stumble into actions that blur the line between justice and revenge. Thus, the Islamic stance is clear. Samson was not a prophet, for no prophet could end in such a way. At best, he was a man of unusual strength, whose life was preserved in Israel's history as a warning of what happens when vows are neglected and desire rules the heart. Here the tension between the two traditions sharpens. Christianity can read Samson as a type, a shadow pointing forward to Christ. His arms stretched wide between two pillars can be imagined as a distorted foreshadowing of the cross, a death that brings deliverance. Yet the comparison breaks under scrutiny, for Christ's death was chosen in love, not vengeance, in obedience, not rebellion, in sacrifice, not wrath. Islam, meanwhile, refuses such foreshadowing altogether, denying that God's chosen would ever be reduced to blind rage as their final testimony. In the Islamic lens, the deliverer is not broken by passion, but stands whole as a mirror of divine guidance. And so the interfaith challenge confronts us. If the Bible calls Samson's death deliverance, and Islam calls it unfit for prophecy, what do we believe about God's will? Does God glorify vengeance or only forgiveness? Does strength serve holiness when it ends in self-destruction? Or is such an ending proof that the man was never a prophet to begin with? Can we trust a story where the greatest act of faith is collapsing a temple upon oneself? Or must we seek another vision of what divine victory looks like? These questions refuse easy answers. They reach beyond Samson into the very heart of our understanding of God. The chains of bronze and the prayers of iron still echo. They ask whether power without purity is ever safe, whether vengeance can ever be called holy, whether death chosen in wrath can be victory at all. The Bible and the Quran stand apart here, one offering a tale of flawed triumph, the other offering silence that denies such a story a place in prophecy. And we who listen are left to choose which vision we follow. Is holiness found in the trembling of pillars or in the endurance of truth? Is God's strength shown in vengeance or in patience? The answer to Samson's riddle may remain hidden, but the question it asks cannot be avoided. The great temple of Gaza stood like a crown upon the Philistine city, its pillars thick with stone and its roof broad enough to hold the weight of thousands. It was not only a place of worship, but a place of pride, the house of Dagon, their god of grain, their god of victory, their god of conquest. In its shadow, Samson once tore the gates of the city from their hinges and carried them to the hill before Hebron, but now he entered not as conqueror, but as prisoner. His eyes were hollow caves where vision had been stolen. His wrists bore the bite of iron chains. His steps were guided by a boy half his size. The laughter of the crowd rose as he was led into the center of their festival, a living trophy paraded before nobles and commoners, mocked as the broken relic of a people subdued. The lords of the Philistines had arranged a feast to celebrate his capture. The temples swelled with their numbers, and the galleries above overflowed with men and women eager to see the giant who had once terrified their nation. Music clashed against laughter, the smell of roasted meat mingled with incense, and everywhere there was the chant of victory to Dagon. "Our God has delivered Samson into our hands," they cried. They believed the blindness of Israel's judge was proof of their idol's power, and their festival was as much a taunt against the God of Israel as it was a celebration of their own triumph. When they called for Samson to perform, it was not entertainment they desired, but mockery. Every stumble, every faltering step was fuel for their laughter. Every scar upon his face was a hymn to their God. Samson stood in the heart of that mockery, his body weakened, but his mind burning with memory. He remembered the angel who had promised his birth, his mother who had kept the vow with trembling devotion, the years when strength surged through his veins like lightning. He remembered the lion in the vineyard, the riddle at the feast, the gates of Gaza, the jawbone dripping with the defeat of armies. And he remembered the lap of Delilah, the razor whispering across his scalp, the moment when his power left him, the laughter of enemies when his eyes were taken. Now he stood in the place where all those memories converged, his story a tapestry woven of triumph and tragedy, obedience and betrayal. The pillars of Gaza were not merely stone, they were the measure of his life, the test of what remained of his faith. He asked the boy who guided him to lead him to the pillars. His hands reached for the cold stone, fingers spread against the weight that held up the house. Beneath his palms, he felt the lives of thousands balanced on the structure, heard the murmur of crowds above, the shifting of bodies on the galleries, the footsteps of lords celebrating their God. And there, in the heart of humiliation, Samson prayed. His prayer was short and desperate. "O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee only this once, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." He did not ask for release. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not even ask for Israel's deliverance. He asked for vengeance, for the strength to repay his blindness. And in that raw plea, the scriptures say, God answered. Samson bowed with all his might, his body bent like a bow straining against its last arrow. His muscles, long weakened by chains, surged again with divine fire. The pillars groaned beneath his push, the roof trembled, cracks split the stone. The festival turned to terror as screams replaced laughter, as the floor beneath their feet buckled. The roof collapsed, timbers and stones falling like judgment, crushing lords and nobles, men and women, commoner and ruler alike. Samson fell with them, buried under the ruin he had unleashed. In his death, he slew more than he had in his life. His family later retrieved his body, laying him to rest between Zorah and Eshtaol, where his story closed in the dust but lived on in memory. The Bible frames this ending as both deliverance and tragedy. Deliverance, because Samson's final act brought defeat upon Israel's enemies, striking a blow so great that it reverberated through generations. Tragedy, because the man chosen before birth to begin Israel's deliverance ended his life in vengeance and ruin. He was not the prophet who spoke God's words, nor the king who ruled in justice, but the judge whose strength was both gift and curse, whose greatest victory came in his own death. His life becomes a parable of wasted potential, of vows broken, of grace that returned at the last moment. He is remembered among the judges as both warning and hope, a man whose faith flickered but did not die, whose final breath was both prayer and destruction. Islam, however, cannot accept such an ending for a prophet. In the Quran, the messengers of God do not die in despair or vengeance. They do not seek suicide as a path to victory, nor do they confuse justice with personal wrath. In Islam, martyrdom is noble, but martyrdom is defined by the defense of truth and the protection of faith, not by crushing enemies in an act of rage. The silence of the Quran on Samson is itself a statement. This story does not belong among the lives of prophets. At most, he was a figure of history, a man with extraordinary strength, but not a guide, not a messenger. For in Islam, prophets are preserved from sins that cloud their example. They endure hardship but do not fall to lust or vengeance. They are patient in suffering, steadfast in faith, and their deaths are testimonies of submission, not destruction. The contrast could not be sharper. Christianity can look upon Samson as a flawed hero whose brokenness still became an instrument of God's plan, a man who points forward in shadowy symbolism to the cross, arms outstretched as he died to bring deliverance. But Islam rejects the comparison outright, for the cross itself is deed, and no prophet in Islam would end in vengeance. The question then emerges with force: which story tells the truth of God's ways? Does God glorify vengeance when it comes wrapped in chains and blindness? Does he grant power for the sake of collapsing temples, or does he preserve his messengers from such desperate ends? The pillars of Gaza remain standing in the imagination, even though the stones have long since fallen. They stand as symbols of the tension between two visions of faith. One vision embraces the flawed hero, the broken vessel through whom God still works. The other vision insists upon purity in the messenger, a life guarded from flaws that would confuse the message. One sees Samson's death as triumph in tragedy, the other as proof that he could not have been a prophet. Between them lies the question of what kind of God we believe in: a God who works through brokenness, or a God who shields his messengers from it. So the challenge is laid bare. If Samson's death is sacred victory, then what does that teach us about life, about holiness, about vengeance? If Samson's death is unworthy of prophecy, then what does that teach us about the stories we inherit, the texts we trust, the traditions we follow? The pillars of Gaza ask not only what Samson did, but what we believe about God. Was it justice or despair, deliverance or destruction, a prophet's end or a judge's warning? The riddle remains, echoing like the cries beneath the falling roof. Which story is true, and what truth are we willing to live by? The Temple of Gaza was filled with noise the day Samson was brought before the lords of the Philistines. It was a festival of victory, a theater of mockery, a declaration that the God of Israel had fallen silent. The people pressed close together on the upper galleries, their eyes fixed on the blind man shuffling in chains. Music rose to Dagon, their god of grain and fertility, whose temple stood vast with stone pillars holding up a roof heavy with celebration. When the doors opened and Samson was led in by the hand of a boy, the cheers erupted. Here was the man who had slaughtered thousands, the man who had burned their fields, the man who had humiliated their armies. Now he stumbled like an old ox, helpless, ridiculed, no longer feared. The Philistines shouted with one voice, praising Dagon for their triumph, certain that their God had overcome the strength of Israel's God. Samson walked into the laughter, and though his eyes were empty, his memory was not. He could see in his mind the vineyards of Timnah, where a lion once roared and fell beneath his bare hands. He could see the honey glistening in the carcass, the riddle that deceived his enemies. He could see the Philistines struck down by the jawbone of a donkey, the gates of Gaza lifted and carried upon his shoulders. He could see Delilah's lap, the razor flashing in silence, the locks falling like symbols of broken promise. He could see the moment when his arms trembled like reeds, when the spirit had left him, when bronze shackles bit into his skin. Now he stood in the temple of his enemies, surrounded by thousands who mocked his God and praised an idol. His body was weak, his pride was gone, but deep in his soul, a flicker still burned. He asked the boy to guide him to the pillars that held the temple. His hands groped the stone, the weight of the structure humming through the granite into his palms. His breath slowed, his heart pounded. The noise of the crowd blurred into a distant roar. In that moment of silence within, Samson prayed. He did not choose eloquence, nor did he clothe his words in praise. He cried out to God with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. "O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee. Strengthen me only this once, that I may be avenged for my 2 eyes." The prayer was sharp with sorrow and vengeance, not the melody of a prophet, but the cry of a wounded man. Yet heaven answered. Strength flowed into him again, the strength that had left when his vow was broken, the strength that had fled when Delilah betrayed him. It returned in the final moment, enough for one last act. Samson braced himself against the pillars. His arms, once mighty in youth, once humiliated in chains, surged with divine power. He bowed himself with all his might, muscles straining, bones trembling, heart thundering. The pillars cracked, the roof shuddered, the temple groaned under the pressure of wrath. Screams erupted as stones split, as timbers snapped, as dust rained from above. The laughter turned to panic, the songs to shrieks, the music to chaos. With one final surge, Samson brought the house down upon himself and his enemies. Thousands perished, lords and rulers crushed beneath the collapse, and Samson himself died in the ruin. In death he killed more than he had in his life, his last breath a prayer and a vengeance, his last act both triumph and tragedy. His family came to retrieve his body, burying him in the land of his fathers, closing the chapter of the strongest man Israel had ever known. The Bible leaves us with this paradox. Samson was chosen from birth, consecrated as a Nazarite, empowered by God to deliver Israel. Yet his life was marked by failure, by lust, by anger, by betrayal. His final act was both victory and suicide, both deliverance and despair. The writer of Judges does not excuse him, nor does he condemn him. Instead, Samson is left in tension, a flawed hero through whom God still worked, a man whose brokenness could not erase divine purpose. His name enters the list of Israel's judges, but his legacy remains a riddle. Was he an instrument of God, or a warning of what happens when consecration is squandered? Was his death glorious or tragic, holy or desperate? The Bible allows the questions to remain, forcing us to wrestle with a God who uses flawed men for his purposes. In the Quran, however, this story is absent, and the absence is deliberate. Islam does not present prophets who fall into lust, who betray their vows, who seek vengeance in death. A prophet in Islam is preserved from such flaws, for the message must remain untarnished. If prophets are guides, they cannot stumble into actions that confuse justice with rage. They endure suffering, they endure mockery, but their ends are noble, their deaths testimonies of patience and submission. The silence towards Samson is a rejection of the idea that God would glorify vengeance through suicide. In Islam, prophets do not die destroying their enemies in wrath. They die as models of faith, shining without shadow. Thus, Samson cannot be called a prophet in Islam. At most, he is a judge of Israel, a man of strength, a figure of history, but not a messenger of God. Here lies the chasm between the two traditions. Christianity embraces Samson as a flawed vessel, proof that God can work even through weakness, that grace can redeem even the broken. Islam refuses to grant such a man the mantle of prophecy, insisting that messengers must remain pure and exemplary. Christianity finds in his arms outstretched upon the pillars a shadowy foreshadow of the cross, a man whose death brought deliverance. Islam rejects such imagery, for no prophet ends in vengeance, and no prophet dies in destruction. The two visions stand opposed, and the reader must choose which reveals the true face of God. The interfaith challenge rises with the weight of those falling stones. If God answered Samson's prayer for vengeance, what does that teach us about God's justice? If God glorified a man's death in the destruction of his enemies, what does that say about holiness? If Islam is right that prophets must be sinless and steadfast, then was Samson's story ever meant to be told as prophecy? Or is it the tale of a man whose failures became a warning rather than a model? And if Christianity is right, that God works through broken vessels, then do we accept that even vengeance and despair can become instruments of deliverance? The pillars of Gaza stand not only in history, but in faith. They ask us whether strength without holiness can ever be trusted, whether vengeance can ever be called sacred, whether a man's death in rage can be God's plan. They ask whether God's messengers are flawless guides or flawed instruments. They force us to confront our own understanding of holiness, to decide whether we believe in a God who redeems the brokenness of men or a God who shields his prophets from it. Samson's story refuses to be silent, even in Islam's silence. It demands an answer. Which vision of God will we believe? The one who answered Samson's desperate prayer, or the one who would never allow such a prayer to belong to prophecy? The air in Gaza trembled with celebration when the Philistines gathered in the temple of Dagon. They thought themselves secure, thought their God vindicated, thought Israel's God defeated. The judge who once terrorized their land stood before them blind, humiliated, and chained. To them he was no longer Samson the mighty, but Samson the broken, Samson the conquered. The pillars that held the temple upright mirrored the scene itself. Two massive stones carrying the weight of thousands, two supports bearing the laughter of those who mocked heaven. Yet within that hall of pride, the final act of Samson's story was being written, and every voice raised against him would soon fall silent beneath the collapse of stone. Samson stood between the pillars, his hands pressed against the cold hardness of their surface. His ears drank in the sound of mockery, but his heart reached upward. He prayed, not with the confidence of a prophet secure in his mission, but with the desperation of a man who had lost everything. He asked God for strength one last time, not to free his people, not to glorify God's name before the nations, but to avenge his eyes. His words were stripped of beauty, his plea was raw. Remember me, strengthen me only this once. The Bible records no reply, no angel, no thunder. Yet in the silence came power. His arms surged with energy that had once seemed lost forever, his chest filled with the breath of a warrior once more. He bowed with all his might, pressing against the pillars with the totality of his body, his soul, his memory, his rage. Temple shook. At first the laughter drowned the sound, but then panic swept through the assembly as cracks splintered the stone. Women screamed, lords shouted, children clung to the robes of their mothers. Dust rained down from the roof, beams groaned as if struck by an earthquake. Samson's arms locked against the pillars, his head lifted toward heaven, and in that instant he became both executioner and victim. The temple collapsed, burying Philistine lords, soldiers, priests, and commoners under its ruin. Samson fell with them, crushed by the same stones he had pulled down. The Bible concludes with a chilling line: "He slew more in his death than he had in his life." Israel's strongest judge was buried beneath rubble, his story sealed by a victory written in blood and stone. The biblical narrative wrestles with paradox. Samson was chosen before birth, his life framed by angelic prophecy, his body empowered with divine strength. Yet he lived recklessly, compromised his vows, squandered his gift, and fell through betrayal. His final act was not a triumph of obedience, but a desperate cry for vengeance. And still, the Bible declares, God answered. This is the tension at the heart of his story: a man flawed to the core, yet still an instrument in the divine plan. His life does not shine with holiness, but flickers with contradiction. His death is not clean sacrifice, but violent destruction. And yet within that contradiction, Israel found deliverance. For Islam, such a story cannot belong to prophecy. The Quran offers no mention of Samson, no recounting of Delilah, no echo of Gaza's collapsing temple. Prophets in Islam are protected from the flaws that plagued Samson. They are not driven by lust, not betrayed by women, not led into destruction by vengeance. They do not fall into sins so deep that their final act must be vengeance against their enemies. In the Islamic framework, a prophet must be an exemplar of obedience and purity, a guide whose life is unmarred by disgrace. Samson's ending in the Bible disqualifies him from prophecy in Islam. At most, he is remembered as a judge of Israel, a figure of strength used for a time, a lesson of warning. His death is seen not as holy martyrdom, but as desperate suicide, unfit to be called the destiny of a messenger of God. This difference exposes the deep divide between the two traditions. In Christianity, Samson's arms outstretched between the pillars can be interpreted as a shadow of the cross, his death pointing forward to Christ who would die to deliver humanity. But the comparison breaks apart upon closer inspection. Christ's death was love, Samson's death was vengeance. Christ's death was obedience, Samson's death was desperation. Christ's death was sacrifice for all, Samson's death was destruction of his enemies. Islam rejects the comparison entirely, for no prophet ends in vengeance, and no prophet is glorified in self-destruction. Islam keeps its messengers pure, untangled from lust, untouched by betrayal, unsullied by rage. The Bible, by contrast, embraces Samson's flaws, declaring that even in brokenness God can work, even in despair God can act. Here the interfaith challenge presses upon us. If the Bible celebrates Samson's death as deliverance, then what does this mean for the holiness of God? Does God glorify vengeance? Does God sanctify self-destruction? Does God deliver his people through the wrath of a flawed man crushed beneath a pagan temple? And if Islam is correct that prophets must be preserved from such flaws, then is Samson's story proof that he was never meant to be counted among prophets at all? Are we reading history or parable, truth or legend? Which vision of God is true? The one who redeems broken men through violent ends, or the one who shields his messengers from such collapse? The pillars of Gaza do not only belong to history, they belong to faith itself. They stand as questions in stone, pressing against our own hearts. Is strength without holiness safe? Is vengeance a path to justice? Can brokenness become divine instrument, or must God's messengers stand unbroken? The answers divide the traditions. Christianity points to grace that works even through weakness. Islam points to purity that guards the message from confusion. The stones of Gaza ask us not only what Samson did, but what we believe about God. Was his death victory or despair, deliverance or destruction, holiness or tragedy? The temple has fallen, but its echoes remain, challenging us still. Among all the details of Samson's story, none has provoked more wonder and debate than his hair. From the moment of his birth, it was set apart by vow. The angel who visited his mother announced that he would be a Nazarite from the womb, consecrated to God in a way that marked every strand upon his head. No razor was ever to touch it, for in those locks lay the sign of his covenant. And so the boy grew, his hair lengthening with the years, each curl a reminder that he belonged not to himself, but to the God of Israel. The scripture presents his hair as more than ornament, more than culture, more than flesh. It became the outward token of divine strength. To touch, it was to touch his consecration. To cut, it was to sever his vow. The Bible's narrative insists that his power was not in muscle alone. His victories came when the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and yet the Spirit was always described in connection with his Nazarite vow. When he tore the lion in the vineyard, when he struck down Philistines by the hundreds, when he lifted the gates of Gaza, the text frames these feats as eruptions of divine power flowing through the vessel of a man set apart. The hair symbolized that consecration. It was the visible reminder that he was different, a man whose very body carried a vow. The command was simple: no wine, no touch of the dead, no blade upon the head. As long as the vow remained, the strength remained. To break it was to forfeit the gift. This symbolism reached its crisis in the lap of Delilah. 3 times Samson lied about the secret of his strength, but at last he confessed that his hair was the key. When the razor passed over his head, when the locks fell to the floor, the scripture mourns, he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. His hair had been the outward sign of an inward covenant, and when it was cut, the Spirit withdrew. The man who had never lost in battle fell in an instant, captured like a child. The Philistines gouged out his eyes, chained him with bronze, and set him to grind grain. The strongest man of Israel became the weakest, and all because a blade touched his head. The mystery of his hair became the mystery of his strength, and for generations readers have wondered, was it truly his hair that carried power, or was the hair only a symbol of something deeper? The Bible does not leave the question unanswered. After his fall, the text records one line heavy with promise: howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. The statement suggests more than biology. It is a theological note, hinting that his consecration was not utterly lost, that renewal was possible. The return of his hair became the return of his vow, the silent promise that his strength could yet be restored. And indeed, when he prayed in the temple of Dagon, when he pressed against the pillars, his strength returned. The hair had grown, the covenant was remembered, and God answered one last time. Thus his hair becomes not only the cause of his downfall, but also the sign of his final deliverance. It is a story woven in strands, each lock carrying meaning far beyond flesh. Yet the mystery troubles many. Could it truly be that power lay in something as fragile as hair? Was the Almighty bound to the length of a man's locks? Or was the hair simply the visible symbol of obedience, a reminder that strength was conditional upon consecration? Scholars wrestle with the question. Some argue that Samson's strength was physical and supernatural, tied mysteriously to his vow, and when the vow was broken, the power left. Others argue that the hair itself had no magic, that it was only a symbol, and that God withdrew his spirit when Samson broke his consecration. The truth may lie between, the hair as outward token, the spirit as inward power, the two bound together in mystery. What cannot be denied is that the scripture presents the hair as central, the turning point of his story. In Islam, this element of the tale is absent, and its absence is significant. The Quran does not tie divine power to hair or to physical signs of ritual vow. Power belongs only to Allah, and He grants it to whom He wills, when He wills, without being bound to strands of flesh. The prophets of Islam are not defined by physical tokens, but by their message, their obedience, their purity. Moses carried a staff, but it was not the wood that mattered, it was the command of God. Jesus healed the blind, but it was not his hands that carried the power, it was Allah who made the clay live. In the same way, Islamic teaching rejects the idea that hair could contain divine strength. To Islam, such details belong to myth or symbol, not to prophetic truth. The silence of the Quran on Samson suggests that his story is not part of the prophetic pattern, that it may carry meaning as legend or parable, but not as divine instruction. This difference points to a deeper divide between the two traditions. The Bible embraces physical symbols, altars, sacrifices, temples, vows that point to invisible realities. Islam strips away such symbols, insisting that God's power is direct, not tied to ritual flesh. In Christianity, Samson's hair becomes a parable of consecration, lost and regained, a warning that disobedience can sever the Spirit's presence. In Islam, such a tale would be dismissed as misunderstanding, for no prophet's mission depends on hair, no covenant rests on locks. The Quran's silence protects the message from confusion, leaving no room for superstition. And so we are left with a challenge. If Samson's hair truly carried divine strength, then what does that mean for our understanding of holiness? Does obedience rest in physical tokens? Does God's power flow through strands of flesh? Or was the hair only a sign, a reminder that strength comes through obedience, and when obedience is lost, strength departs? If Islam is correct, then the story of Samson reveals the danger of mistaking symbol for substance. The peril of believing power can rest in hair rather than in God. But if Christianity is correct, then Samson's hair stands as a reminder that consecration is visible, that vows matter, that even the smallest outward sign can carry eternal weight. The strands of his story remain tangled. Some see miracle, some see myth, some see misunderstood covenant. The Bible insists that his hair mattered. The Quran insists that such things do not define prophecy. Between them lies the question of what we believe about God's power. Is it bound to symbols or free above them? Is it tied to vows marked in flesh or beyond ritual entirely? Samson's hair falls to the floor in Delilah's house, and with it fall the certainties of our understanding. The question lingers like a riddle. Was it miracle, myth, or misunderstood covenant? From the earliest days of his youth, Samson's hair was not merely an accident of growth, but a deliberate sign. His mother guarded it with devotion, never letting a blade come near it. Each curl carried memory, each strand whispered of a vow spoken before he could speak himself. The Bible presents his hair as more than human beauty, more than custom, more than chance. It was covenant made visible. Whenever he passed through the villages of Dan, children would watch the long locks flow over his shoulders and know that this was the one marked by God. His hair was the silent sermon of his consecration, the banner of his set-apart life, a daily reminder that he was unlike other men. To Samson, however, the vow seemed less heavy than the thrill of strength. He lifted gates, crushed armies, laughed at ropes, and with every triumph forgot a little more that the power was not his, but God's. The hair remained, but the heart drifted. When Delilah asked for his secret, the hair became the center of the riddle. For the Philistines knew they could not match him in battle. They had tried cords, they had tried ambush, they had tried armies, and each time they fell. Only a secret remained. Delilah pressed him, and at last he yielded. He confessed what his mother had told him before he even learned to walk. No razor had touched his head, for his hair was the sign of his Nazirite vow. To sever, it was to sever his consecration. And so it happened. As he slept, the razor passed, the locks fell, and his strength vanished like smoke in the wind. The words of Judges are heavy with tragedy. He knew not that the Lord had departed from him. Strength gone, eyes taken, body chained, the symbol cut, the covenant broken. Yet the story does not end there. In Gaza, as he ground grain like an ox, the hair began to grow again. The writer of Judges pauses to tell us this, as though the growing hair was more than biology, more than inevitability. It was hope, a quiet sign that consecration could be restored, that covenant was not utterly erased. The hair grew in silence, each strand a reminder that mercy still breathes even after failure. And in his final act, when he prayed and pressed against the pillars, the Spirit returned. His hair had grown, his vow had resurfaced, and the God who had once departed now granted strength one last time. The symbol had been cut, but the God of the symbol still held power. The hair mattered because the vow mattered, and the vow mattered because it bound a man to God. This close connection between physical sign and divine strength is central to the Bible's narrative world. The altar is a place where heaven meets earth, the ark carries presence, the temple embodies glory. Signs point to realities, symbols carry weight, and vows made in flesh reach into eternity. In Samson's case, the hair was such a sign. To cut it was not merely cosmetic, it was covenantal. The Spirit withdrew because the sign of consecration was despised. But when the hair returned, the sign returned, and the mercy of God was shown once more. This theology insists that the visible matters, that obedience has physical form, that even hair can be holy when it is bound to the vow of God. In Islam, the story looks different because it is not told at all. The Quran offers no image of prophets whose strength depends on hair, no teaching that divine power can be severed by scissors. For Islam, Allah's power is direct, unhindered, sovereign. It does not rest in strands of flesh or symbols of ritual. A prophet's authority comes not from physical tokens, but from the purity of his message and the righteousness of his life. In Islam, signs exist. Moses' staff became a serpent, Jesus healed the sick. But each sign is explicit miracle, not a hidden superstition. To imagine that hair carried divine power would be, in Islamic view, to confuse the symbol with the source. God is the giver, not the locks. Thus, Samson does not appear in the Quran, and his hair plays no role in prophetic history. It is treated instead as a tale from Israel's memory, a legend woven with meaning, perhaps with truth, but not fit for the mantle of prophecy. This contrast reveals the different ways the two traditions handle symbol. The Bible often embraces the physical as a vessel of the spiritual. A rainbow is covenant, circumcision is covenant, bread and wine become remembrance. Islam insists on stripping away such intermediaries, declaring that God is above all ritual flesh. The Quran speaks of prayer, of fasting, of pilgrimage, but always as direct obedience, never as superstition, never as hair-carrying holiness. Thus, the story of Samson's locks cannot belong to Islam. It is legend, not prophecy, symbol, not truth. The silence of the Quran protects the clarity of God's message from the confusion of myth. And here rises the interfaith challenge. If Samson's strength truly depended on his hair, then what does this say about the nature of divine power? Is God's spirit so fragile that it rests upon strands? Does holiness reside in flesh, or does flesh only carry the reminder? If Christianity is right, then Samson's hair teaches that outward signs matter, that consecration has visible tokens, that obedience is written upon the body. If Islam is right, then Samson's story warns us not to mistake symbol for source, not to believe that power can be bound to hair. Between the two lies the question of our own faith. Do we trust in visible vows or in the invisible God above them? Do we believe in a holiness that lives in flesh or in one that rises above flesh entirely? The strands of Samson's hair fall to the floor of Delilah's house, and with them fall our certainties, forcing us to ask, is this miracle, myth, or misunderstood covenant? The mystery of Samson's hair lingers over his entire story like a shadow that never fades. Long before he became judge of Israel, long before he carried gates or slew Philistines, the angel had spoken to his mother that no razor must touch his head. The vow was not invented by Samson nor by his parents, but by divine decree. His locks became the outward testimony that his life was consecrated. With every strand, his mother remembered the promise. With every passing year, the people remembered that God had set him apart. When he walked through the villages, his uncut hair was as much a sermon as his feats of strength. It was not mere ornament, it was covenant visible upon the body. And when Delilah's blade severed it, the covenant seemed to break. In that moment, the man who once toppled armies found himself weaker than a child, bound and blinded, mocked by those he had terrified. Thus the hair was no trivial symbol. It was the hinge of his destiny. The Bible does not hesitate to connect his power to his hair. Again and again, the text emphasizes that his vow as a Nazarite was the condition of his strength. His victories came when the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and his consecration was the channel through which that Spirit worked. When the vow was broken, the Spirit departed. When the hair was restored, the symbol of consecration returned, and the Spirit returned with it. The story refuses to allow us to see the hair as meaningless. It was both sign and safeguard, the visible reminder of a hidden covenant. In the temple of Dagon, when Samson prayed and pressed against the pillars, the note that his hair had grown again served as the theological link between the return of his vow and the return of his strength. Thus, the Bible insists, the hair mattered because consecration mattered, and the two were bound together by divine will. And yet this raises difficult questions. How can strands of keratin hold such weight? Could the Almighty truly bind his spirit to something as fragile as hair? Was it not God himself who granted strength and not the locks? The text leaves the tension unresolved. Some argue that the hair itself had no mystical power, that it was only the outward sign of obedience, and God withdrew his spirit when the sign was despised. Others insist that the hair carried holiness in itself, a sacramental vessel of divine power. What cannot be denied is that the narrative draws an unbreakable link between Samson's hair and his destiny. The razor became the instrument of his downfall, and the growth of the locks became the silent promise of restoration. It is a story of covenant written upon the body, a parable in strands, a riddle of flesh and spirit. For Islam, such a tale cannot belong to prophecy. The Quran never mentions Samson, and this silence is not accident but argument. In Islam, God's power does not depend on hair or flesh or ritual. It depends only on his will. Prophets in Islam are defined not by symbols but by message, not by physical tokens but by purity of life and truth of word. To imagine that divine strength could vanish because a razor touched the head is, in Islamic thought, to confuse the symbol with the source. God is not bound to hair. God does not make his spirit captive to ritual. In the Quran, prophets are guarded from such confusion, preserved from weakness that would make their mission doubtful. They are not betrayed by hair, nor defeated by scissors. They carry authority because God has chosen them, and that choice is not fragile. Thus, Islam leaves Samson unspoken, for his story belongs not to the gallery of prophets, but to the annals of flawed men. This difference between traditions is profound. The Bible embraces the paradox that God can work through flawed vessels, that consecration can be tied to physical signs, that strength can vanish and return with the cutting and regrowth of hair. Islam strips away such paradox, declaring that God's power is direct and sovereign, untethered to ritual flesh. One tradition sees in Samson's hair the visible mark of holiness. The other sees in the silence a rejection of superstition. One declares that outward signs matter deeply, the other insists that truth rises above them. Between them stands the question of how we understand the relationship between symbol and reality, body and spirit, flesh and faith. And here lies the interfaith challenge. If Samson's hair truly carried divine strength, then what does this mean for our own faith? Are we to believe that God binds his spirit to symbols so fragile, so easily severed? Or are we to believe that such details are myth, misunderstood covenant, stories born from human imagination? If the Bible is true, then Samson's hair is a warning that consecration must be guarded, that vows matter, that even the smallest outward sign can carry eternal consequence. If Islam is true, then Samson's hair is a caution. Do not mistake symbol for substance. Do not confuse ritual for reality. Do not believe that God's power depends on hair. The strands fall to the floor of Delilah's chamber, and with them fall our certainties. The question remains, was it miracle, myth, or misunderstood covenant? And what we decide shapes not only how we read Samson, but how we understand God himself. The story of Samson is not only about strength and downfall, but about desire that never found discipline. From the very beginning, the Bible portrays him as a man drawn to women who lay outside the covenant of Israel. His first great passion was for a woman of Timnah, a Philistine whom he demanded his parents secure as his wife. They pleaded with him to choose from among his own people, but Samson refused, declaring that she pleased his eyes. This was the first sign that his heart followed sight more than calling. The wedding ended in betrayal, his riddle answered by deceit, and blood shed to pay the wager. Yet Samson did not learn. His eyes continued to wander, his strength continued to serve his desires rather than his vow. Later, the text tells us, Samson visited a prostitute in Gaza. Word spread quickly, and the Philistines surrounded the city to kill him at dawn. But Samson rose at midnight, tore the gates of the city from their hinges, and carried them to the hill before Hebron. Once more his strength saved him, but the story lingers over the choice he made, to spend the night in sin, to walk willingly into the embrace of lust. The judge of Israel, consecrated from birth, could not master the impulses that burned within him. He carried gates like feathers, but he could not carry his own heart with equal discipline. The pattern was set. His victories were divine, but his choices were destructive. His life was a paradox of holiness and hunger, consecration and corruption. Finally, the story brings us to Delilah, the most famous of his lovers. She lived in the valley of Sorek, and Samson loved her. Once more his passion burned for a woman outside Israel's covenant, Once more his eyes betrayed his calling. The Philistine lords saw their opportunity, promising Delilah silver if she could discover the secret of his strength. She pressed him day after day until he yielded, and in her lap his hair was shorn, his vow broken, his strength gone. His lust for Delilah was not innocent affection, it was the snare that led to his downfall. The strongest man of Israel fell not by armies, but by his own unchecked desires. The narrative makes no attempt to hide this truth. Samson's lust was his ruin, his eyes the gate through which his enemies entered. Lust blinded him long before the Philistines did. In the Bible, Samson becomes the cautionary tale of desire without discipline. He was consecrated to God, yet spent his life chasing women who served idols. He was given strength to deliver Israel, yet wasted it in beds that betrayed him. He was chosen from birth, yet squandered his calling in pursuit of pleasure. His life is the parable of power undone by passion, holiness destroyed by hunger. And yet, even here, the paradox remains. For though Samson's lust led to his downfall, God still worked through his life, still used his brokenness to strike Israel's enemies. His death in Gaza delivered a victory greater than all his living triumphs. Thus, the Bible declares, God can work even through flawed men, even through those who fail in desire. But the lesson remains. Lust leads to ruin, and Samson's ruin stands as warning. In Islam, such a story cannot belong to prophecy. The Quran does not speak of Samson, nor of Delilah, nor of Timnah, nor of Gaza's prostitute. The silence is itself a judgment. For prophets in Islam are preserved from such sins. They do not fall into lust. They do not chase women outside their faith. They do not squander their calling in beds of betrayal. The Quran presents prophets as pure examples, untainted by the weaknesses that plagued Samson. Joseph, when tempted by the wife of Potiphar, fled, declaring that the prison was better than sin. Muhammad was commanded to lower his gaze, to guard his heart. Prophets are models of chastity and obedience, not warnings of lust. Thus, Islam does not count Samson among the prophets. His story belongs to Israel's history, perhaps as judge, perhaps as legend, but not as messenger of God. The preservation of prophets in Islam ensures that no follower can doubt their example, no believer can excuse sin by pointing to their lives. Lust does not belong in the lives of those chosen to guide mankind. This contrast between traditions is sharp. Christianity embraces Samson's brokenness, declaring that even lust and failure cannot thwart God's plan. God's grace shines through weakness, his power works through flawed vessels. Samson's lust is acknowledged, even condemned, but his life is still used as part of God's story. Islam rejects this entirely. Prophets are not flawed vessels. They are pure lanterns of truth, their lives unblemished by lust, their examples safe for all generations. The two visions cannot be reconciled. One insists that God redeems even the broken. The other insists that God never chooses the broken in the first place. One sees Samson's lust as tragedy that God used. The other sees it as proof that Samson could not be prophet. And so the interfaith challenge comes to us. If Samson's story is true, then what does it say about holiness? Can a man consecrated from birth waste his life in lust and still be used by God? Does divine power flow through hands unclean? If Christianity is right, then Samson's story is both warning and hope. Warning that lust destroys, hope that grace can still work through the ruined. If Islam is right, then Samson's story is not prophecy at all, but legend, a tale of a judge whose weakness proved that he was never chosen to guide. Which vision reveals the truth of God, a God who redeems the lustful, or a God who preserves his prophets from lust altogether? Samson's story refuses silence. It forces us to decide whether holiness is compatible with weakness, or whether holiness requires preservation from weakness entirely. The Bible returns again and again to the theme of Samson's desire, not as a side note, but as the central weakness that defined his life. His first great choice was to marry a Philistine woman of Timnah. The scriptures are blunt. He saw her, she pleased him, and he demanded that his parents arrange the union. It mattered little to him that she was of the very people oppressing Israel, little that the covenant warned against such marriages. His parents questioned him, urged him to reconsider, but he would not bend. His eyes had seen, and his heart had followed. What began as desire became the thread that unraveled his life. The wedding ended in betrayal, for his riddle was solved by deceit, and his bride was given to another. Enraged, Samson struck down 30 men. His marriage dissolved in blood and fire. From this first passion grew a pattern. The strongest man of Israel was weakest before women, and his lust guided him more than his vow. The story continues with the episode in Gaza. Samson, judge of Israel, entered the house of a prostitute. Word spread quickly, and the Philistines surrounded the city, plotting to kill him at dawn. But Samson rose at midnight, tore the city gates from their hinges, and carried them to the hill before Hebron. It was an act of incredible strength, yet the setting was one of shame. The man consecrated from birth sought pleasure in sin, and his miracle of strength was overshadowed by the scandal of his choice. The Bible presents this without excuse, showing the paradox of a man gifted by God, yet driven by desire. His body was a vessel of divine power, but his heart was a slave to lust. He was chosen to deliver Israel, but he pursued women who belonged to its enemies. Thus, the judge became captive long before the chains of the Philistines ever bound him. Then came Delilah, the woman whose name would forever be tied to betrayal. Samson loved her, though she was not of his people, though she was courted by the lords of the Philistines. She pressed him to reveal his secret, and though he lied at first, his heart grew weary under her persistence. At last he revealed that no razor had touched his head, that his hair was the symbol of his consecration. She cut his locks, and his strength departed. Lust had led him into her arms, and lust had led him to betrayal. The strongest of men fell by the gentlest of snares. The story does not veil the truth. Samson's downfall was the fruit of his desires. He conquered armies, but he could not conquer himself. He judged Israel for 20 years, yet his own heart was never ruled. His lust was not a private sin, but the root of national humiliation, for through it Israel's judge was blinded and enslaved. The biblical narrative is painfully honest. Samson is remembered not as saint but as paradox. His lust led him astray, yet his life still became the tool of God's deliverance. His failures did not erase his calling, though they shaped his end. The message seems to be that God works even through broken men, that grace can shine even through lust. The warning is clear: unchecked desire destroys, but the hope remains. God is not bound by our ruin. Samson's story becomes both caution and comfort, a mirror of human weakness and divine patience. He loved the wrong women, but God still used him. He squandered his vow, but God still answered his final prayer. His lust wrote his tragedy, yet his faith, broken though it was, still found God's ear in Gaza. In Islam, this entire portrayal is impossible. The Quran does not allow prophets to fall into such sins. Prophets in Islam are preserved from lust, from adultery, from betrayal. They are chosen not only for their message, but for their purity. They cannot be examples of weakness, for they are guides for all people. Islam presents Joseph as the counterpoint. Tempted by the wife of Potiphar, he resisted, declaring that prison was better than sin. He fled temptation, choosing righteousness over desire. This is the prophetic model in Islam: chastity, purity, steadfastness. To imagine a prophet lying in the lap of a woman who betrayed him is unthinkable in the Quran. Thus, Samson is not called a prophet in Islam. At most, he is remembered as a man of strength in Israel's history, but not as one entrusted with God's message. His lust disqualifies him from prophecy. His desires prove his humanity, not his holiness. This difference reveals two visions of holiness. In Christianity, Samson's flaws are embraced as part of a larger story of grace. Even lust and failure cannot stop God's plan. His life is both warning and hope, showing that God can use broken vessels. In Islam, such a story is unworthy of prophecy. The prophets are preserved as perfect examples, and their lives cannot confuse the faithful. Samson's lust is therefore proof that he was never prophet at all. One tradition finds comfort in God's use of weakness, the other finds clarity in God's preservation of his messengers. The two cannot be reconciled. Either God chooses the flawed and works through them, or he shields his chosen from such flaws entirely. The challenge, then, is sharp. If Samson's story is true, then what does it mean for us? Can we believe in a God who allows his chosen to waste their lives in lust and still calls them instruments of deliverance? Or must we believe in a God who never entrusts his message to the lustful, who protects his prophets from such sins? Which vision reveals the truth of holiness? Is it comfort that God redeems even lust, or is it clarity that God prevents it altogether? The Bible and the Quran diverge, and Samson stands at the crossroads. He loved the wrong women, and in his love he fell. But in that fall, the two faiths see two different gods, one who redeems through brokenness, and one who preserves from brokenness entirely. Desire is a quiet river at first, and Samson stepped into it as though its depth were known. The Bible shows him seeing first and choosing later, led by the eyes that delighted and the heart that followed. The woman of Timnah pleased him, and he would not be advised. The feast turned to riddle, the riddle to betrayal, and the betrayal to violence. Then the house in Gaza where a prostitute waited and a city plotted, and yet he rose at midnight and walked away with its gates upon his shoulders, a man whose miracles disguised his wounds. Finally, the valley of Sorek, where Delilah's voice was patient and her question did not need to shout. Tell me where your strength lies. The judge of Israel, who could break armies by the hundreds, could not master this one request. He lied once, he lied twice, he lied a third time, and each lie carried him closer to the truth he should never have spoken. In the end, he placed his head where steel could reach it, and the vow that had rested upon his hair since the womb fell to the floor. The Philistines did not defeat him with swords. Desire defeated him with a whisper. The story does not pretend that this was an accident. The pattern was old as Eden. He saw, he desired, he took, he regretted. Samson's eyes were a gate through which an enemy entered long before iron fetters closed around his wrists. He was marked by God, filled with strength that startled the land, yet he lived like a man who trusted the next moment to be as lenient as the last. When he found honey in the carcass of the lion, he tasted sweetness pulled out of what should be forbidden. The parable followed him, sweetness from the eater, but he did not learn that sweetness can also conceal poison when a vow grows thin. He touched what he should not touch, he ate what he should not eat, he lay where he should not sleep, and still the Spirit rushed upon him because mercy is patient. The patience of God is not permission, and the harvest waits for a season only to arrive in a single night. Blinded and chained, Samson entered the longest day of his life. There at the mill, with a wheel that circled like a year that refused to end, he met the teacher that strength had never let him hear. The teacher's name was Consequence, and its lesson was simple. A vow does not keep a man who will not keep a vow. His hair began to grow again, a detail the writer underlines as if to say that God can begin with small mercies while a man learns to breathe in the dark. The slow weight of the wheel gave him hours to sort memory from excuse. He remembered the hands of his mother in the light of a clay lamp. He remembered the first time a razor was lifted above another boy's head and turned away from his. He remembered the dry taste of a carcass in his mouth and the fire that once filled his arms. He remembered Delilah's question and his own voice giving away what he had been given to protect. There in the quiet, he learned to pray without victory, and the prayer that later rose in the temple was not elegant, but it was honest. Remember me, strengthen me this once. The Bible allows a paradox that refuses to be domesticated. Samson is placed among Israel's judges and, in the letter to the Hebrews, remembered among those who believed. The same man who wasted his calling in the house of a prostitute and in the lap of a betrayer is named in the hall where faith is honored. If this offends, it is meant to. The story announces that God may draw a straight line with a broken stick, and that deliverance may come wrapped in the tangle of a ruined life. But the story does not bless the ruin. It records it so that none mistake grace for approval. Lust did not help him fulfill his calling. It almost erased it. What God accomplished through his death might have been written through his life if he had governed his heart as he governed his enemies. The judge who could lift gates could not lift his own eyes from what pleased him, and the cost of his softness fell upon a nation. Consider the rhythm of his days before the fall. When trouble came, he relied not on wisdom, but on the surge of sudden strength. When insulted, he answered with fire. When lonely, he answered with a visit in Gaza. When flattered, he answered with a secret. His life became a sequence of reactions that looked like leadership because victory kept arriving. The miracles hid the rot. Victories are not verdicts. A gift can carry a man further than his character can, and when the gift stops speaking for him, the witnesses who once cheered will suddenly remember what they saw. In the dungeon, no one applauded. The boy who led him by the hand did not know that he guided a man who should have guided a people. The wheel kept turning. His hair kept growing. The vow waited where he had left it. Desire in Scripture is not condemned because beauty is evil, but because reverence makes a guard for the eyes and the heart. Samson handled beauty like a man who keeps fire in dry grass. It lit the horizon with light for a moment, and then it took everything. Even his final prayer bore the imprint of his wounds. He did not ask to live. He did not ask to lead. He asked to be avenged for his 2 eyes. God granted power without endorsing motive, because God can write judgment on a festival program when a nation mocks him, and because even a broken faith reaches farther than a satisfied idol. The temple fell, and with it, the argument that Dagon could keep what God wished to reclaim. The biblical narration does not hide the truth that the wrong women were not the cause but the context. Samson's heart was the battlefield. The women were doors he opened himself. The first door was sight, the second was desire, the third was entitlement, and the fourth was secrecy. He lived like a man whose calling would bend to his appetite, and when appetite finally bent his calling, the cost became public. Ancient stories are severe on this point because nations rise and fall on the private vows of their public men. A judge who refuses to be judged by his own vow becomes a danger to the people he is meant to protect. The mercy of God retrieves what it can. It retrieved a final victory out of Samson's end, but the mercy did not erase the fact that his years could have been different. In those same pages, another pattern shines, and it is not Samson's. Joseph was tempted and fled, choosing chains over the warm invitation of a closed room. Boaz guarded Ruth rather than take what a lonely night might have offered. David, who failed later, is celebrated earlier for refusing a crown he could have taken by force. And then David's failure shows the same pattern that haunts Samson, proving that even kings must guard their eyes. The Bible is not a gallery of marble statues. It is a field hospital where wounds are named and the medicine is not pride. Samson's story is the case study for a diagnosis that the text repeats without apology. Desire without discipline does not end with delight. It ends with eyes put out and hands on a mill. Now turn to Islam and listen to the silence that surrounds Samson. The Quran does not place him among the messengers. It does not let his life touch the pattern that believers are told to imitate. In Islam, the prophets are preserved by God from the sins that would make their message suspect. The word many scholars use for this protection is the guarding of the prophets. It does not deny that they are human, that they grow, that they face opposition, that they suffer. It denies that their surrender to lust or to betrayal is allowable within the story of guidance. The Quran honors Joseph with a mirror opposite of Samson's record. When desire pressed, Joseph remembered his Lord, chose the prison, and spoke the truth even when the room was locked and the proofs were arranged to accuse him. The difference is not small. It defines the prophetic role in Islam as a lantern that does not flicker in the wind. Islam's messenger taught the lowering of the gaze, the guard over the heart, the fasting that teaches control, the modesty that is both cloth and posture. The outward deeds do not replace the inward guard, they train it. The prophetic model in Islam is therefore safe to follow in every room. A young believer can read the story and not be told to imitate the strength while excusing the bed. The bed is not there. The bed is a test that the prophet passes in the story that Islam tells. This is why Samson does not belong to the circle of prophecy in the Quranic horizon. The pattern of his life would make the lantern fail where it must be bright. Islam lays the bar where guidance demands it and then records the lives of the messengers at that height. The difference does not mean that Islam denies the danger that undone desire brings. It names it early and often. It places walls around families with duty and dignity and pairs desire with covenant rather than with secrecy. It tells men and women to address one another with gravity and care, and to understand that private rooms grow smaller when the soul is unarmed. It celebrates the one who flees when a closed door slants the floor. In this ethic, the story that one follows shapes the life that one lives. A story where the guide resists is a path that trains resistance. A story where the leader falls is a warning that must not be mistaken for permission. Islam refuses to let warning and permission look the same. Where the two traditions stand together is in the verdict that desire without obedience destroys. Where they separate is in how close this verdict is allowed to approach the lives of those chosen to teach. The Bible leaves Samson's ruin in the canon as part of a longer sermon about grace and consequence, faith and failure, judgment and mercy. Islam chooses to keep the prophetic gallery free of such ruin so that guidance does not stumble upon the threshold of a bedroom. Both aim at holiness. They draw different maps, and human beings who do not live by theory but by habit will be formed by the stories they tell themselves at night. Here the interfaith challenge must be spoken clearly. If God elected Samson to begin deliverance and tolerated his life as it unfolded, then what is holiness in the midst of calling? If holiness is a requirement for guidance, can guidance be entrusted to a man who will not govern his own appetite? If grace can redeem a life deformed by lust, what do we teach when that redemption arrives as a violent end rather than a reformed life? If the Quran's preservation of prophets from such sins is true, what does that tell us about the nature of the message and the gentleness of its bearers? If the Bible's insistence that God can work through failure is true, what does that teach us about hope after collapse? Which vision guards the soul better in the hour when the room is quiet and the invitation is warm? Which story builds the habits that keep the vow from sounding like a riddle? We do not need to pretend that desire is small. We need to decide which light will guide it. Samson teaches that the wrong love at the wrong time in the wrong place can turn a nation's judge into a grinder at a wheel. Islam answers with a portrait of a prophet who turns from the wrong love before it becomes a prison. The Bible answers with a God who can turn even a prison into a place where vows grow back one strand at a time. Between these answers stands the listener who will one day be alone with a choice that does not announce itself as a choice. It will have music and candles and laughter and a question that pretends to be innocent. Tell me where your strength lies. The strongest answer is not spoken into a lap. It is written into a life before the question arrives. If we would not be Samson, we must train the eyes to be honest servants, not kings. We must understand that no victory in public can protect disobedience in private. We must hear that God can forgive and still not choose the ending we would have chosen for ourselves if we had kept the vow. And we must ask whether our teachers should be men who fell where we are told to stand, or men whom God shielded so that we could see what standing looks like without rehearsal in ruin. So the question remains, soft and hard at once. Is holiness more clearly taught by a redeemed collapse or by a guarded life? Is God more greatly honored by the temple falling under a man's final prayer for vengeance, or by the door opening as a man walks away into the night undefeated? The Bible and the Quran give different answers, and both claim to love the listener. Choose the light that will teach your hands what to do when the razor is lifted and the room is quiet and the heart wants what it has no right to have. Choose the story that will still be true when the music stops. The judge who once frightened armies and scattered enemies now walked in chains. The Bible tells us that when Samson's hair was cut and the Spirit of the Lord departed from him, the Philistines rushed in with sudden boldness. Their knives flashed, not to kill but to humiliate. They gouged out his eyes, tearing away not only his sight but the very symbols of his lust. The eyes that had chosen women outside the covenant, the eyes that had feasted on beauty while forgetting the vow, were gone. Then they bound him with bronze shackles, a cruel contrast to the ropes and cords he had once snapped like threads. This time the bonds did not break. They dragged him to Gaza and set him to grinding grain in the prison, a task for beasts, not men. Samson, judge of Israel, the strongest of mortals, became a blind slave chained to a mill. The mighty deliverer reduced to mockery, his downfall complete. The Philistines rejoiced. Their lords praised Dagon, their idol of grain and fertility, declaring that he had delivered Samson into their hands. They sang to their God in triumph, believing that the God of Israel had been defeated. To them, Samson was not only a prisoner, he was proof that their God was stronger, their nation victorious. They saw his blindness as divine judgment, his chains as permanent testimony that their worship had triumphed. They paraded him before their people as trophy, laughed at him, spat on him, forced him to perform like a clown for their entertainment. What Israel had feared now became a festival of humiliation. The strongest man was the weakest, and all because his consecration had been betrayed. In their mockery, however, the seeds of their own downfall were being planted. For while Samson turned the wheel in Gaza, the Bible quietly notes a detail. His hair began to grow again. The symbol of his vow, once cut, now returned. The Philistines did not care, for to them he was finished, his strength gone forever. They did not understand that the God of Israel was not bound to their triumph, that consecration once broken could begin again. Each strand that sprouted was a whisper of hope, a reminder that God's mercy had not utterly departed. Samson's body weakened under chains, but his spirit began to awaken in the darkness. He who once lived by impulse now had time to reflect. Every circle of the millstone taught him consequence. Every creak of the wheel reminded him of vows forgotten. In blindness, he saw more clearly than ever before. And in that darkness, he learned to pray, not as a victor demanding triumph, but as a broken man remembering the God who had chosen him from birth. The chains of bronze bit into his flesh, but they also became the forge where his soul was reshaped. No longer did he rise with arrogance, no longer did he boast of riddles and feasts. He labored like an animal, and the grinding stone carved humility into his bones. The Philistines thought him defeated, but God was preparing him for a different kind of battle. His hands, though chained, learned again the feel of strength in weakness. His heart, though heavy, found again the rhythm of prayer. When the time came, the man who had been broken would be ready for one last act that would etch his name into history. The biblical picture of Samson in chains is one of paradox. He was humiliated, but he was not abandoned. He was blinded, but he was not forgotten. His hair grew again, his prayer grew again, his strength would return. The story insists that even when consecration is broken, God can restore. Even when vows are betrayed, mercy can return. Even when strength is lost, it can rise again. Samson's chains became prayers, his bronze bonds became iron faith. In the prison of Gaza, the strongest man became the weakest, and in that weakness, he found the God who had always been his strength. In the Quran, however, such a story is absent. Islam does not tell of Samson grinding grain in Gaza, does not speak of his hair, does not recount his chains. This silence reflects the Islamic vision of prophecy. Prophets are preserved from the sins that led Samson to this place. They are not betrayed by lust, not blinded by enemies, not humiliated in chains because of their own failures. In Islam, prophets suffer, but their suffering is for truth, not for their weakness. They endure persecution from enemies, but they do not bring judgment upon themselves by squandering vows. The prison of Samson has no place in the Quran, for prophets in Islam are models of purity, and their stories cannot confuse holiness with failure. Thus, Samson is not called a prophet. His story belongs to history, not to prophecy. The Quran guards the image of prophets so that their examples remain pure, untangled from lust and humiliation. This difference matters deeply. In Christianity, Samson's chains are embraced as part of the paradox of grace, that God can still work through failure, that even the weakest can be used. His story is both warning and comfort, warning that lust destroys, comfort that God redeems. In Islam, such comfort cannot come through prophetic collapse. The prophets are kept pure, their chains are only those of persecution for truth, not consequence for sin. The silence of Islam on Samson is therefore not neglect, but protection, ensuring that no believer confuses holiness with ruin. One vision shows God redeeming the broken. The other shows God preserving his messengers from being broken in this way at all. Here the interfaith challenge presses in. If the Bible is true, then Samson's chains teach us that God works even through those who fall, that grace can restore even the ruined. But if the Quran is true, then Samson's chains are proof that he was never prophet, that prophets cannot fall into lust and betrayal. Which vision do we trust? Do we believe in a God who redeems the brokenness of men, or in a God who shields his prophets from such brokenness altogether? The chains of bronze and the prayers of iron ask us not only what Samson's story means, but what kind of God we believe in. Do we worship a God who redeems our ruin, or a God who prevents his messengers from ever reaching such ruin? The answer shapes not only how we read Samson, but how we understand the nature of holiness itself. The Feast of Dagon was the climax of Philistine triumph. Their lords gathered in Gaza, the temples swelling with men and women, 5 rulers seated in pride, and a crowd so vast that even the roof was filled with revelers. The enemy of their nation, the judge of Israel, had been captured, blinded, and chained. Now he was summoned as entertainment. The one who once slaughtered armies was brought forth as a clown, mocked to the sound of laughter and drunken song. Samson stumbled forward, led by the hand of a boy, his empty eye sockets raised toward voices that jeered. They placed him between the pillars of the temple, a stage prepared not for his strength, but for his shame. The festival turned him into a living sacrifice to their idol, proof that Dagon had conquered Yahweh, that Philistine gods were greater than Israel's God. The scene was triumphal, yet within it, the seeds of reversal waited silently. Samson, weary from chains and grinding, whispered to the boy who guided him, "Place my hands on the pillars that support the temple, that I may lean against them." His voice was quiet, his request humble, unnoticed by the drunken crowd. He stood between the 2 great pillars, one hand on each, his body leaning like an old man needing rest. No one suspected that the blind slave was preparing for his final act. Then in silence, Samson prayed, "O Lord God, remember me. Strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, that I may be avenged upon the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It was not a long prayer, not ornate, but desperate and raw. It was the cry of a man who had lost everything, sight, freedom, honor, and who longed for one last breath of purpose. His words did not plead for restoration of his life, but for vengeance in death. Even in prayer, Samson revealed his humanity. He prayed for justice wrapped in revenge, for victory in the hour of humiliation. The Bible records what followed as sudden and final. With strength returned, Samson bent his arms, pressing against the pillars. The stones trembled, the beams cracked, the temple groaned like a beast pierced to its heart. Then the roof fell, crashing down upon lords and commoners alike. The sound of laughter turned to screams, then silence, as dust and rubble buried the worshippers of Dagon. Samson fell with them, his body crushed beneath the ruins, but in his death he killed more than he had in his life. The man who wasted his calling in lust and folly ended as Israel's deliverer in destruction. His life was a tragedy, but his death became a victory. The Bible concludes that he judged Israel 20 years, and his final act was the greatest. The blind slave became the weapon of God, and the temple of idols fell before the name of Yahweh. The paradox of Samson's end lingers. His prayer was not pure, yet it was heard. His motives were not holy, yet God answered. He sought vengeance, and God gave victory. The strongest man died in ruins, but his death glorified God above the idols of Philistia. His story forces us to wrestle with divine mystery. How can God use a man so broken? How can vengeance be mingled with deliverance? The text does not resolve the tension, it preserves it. Samson's life ends not as a saint, but as a paradox. holy strength granted to a man of unholy desires, victory wrought through ruin, redemption written in collapse. His chains became the stage of his greatest triumph, and his blindness led him to see more clearly than ever. Yet the reader cannot escape the ache of wasted potential, the thought of what might have been if Samson had lived with the same consecration he died embracing. In Islam, this ending is unthinkable. The Quran does not allow a prophet to die seeking vengeance for his eyes, nor to pray in bitterness at the end of his life. Prophets in Islam are models of patience, forgiveness, and mercy, not men whose final breath is consumed by revenge. Their miracles are not tied to lust or collapse, but to truth and guidance. They do not destroy temples out of personal humiliation, but call people to worship God in clarity. Thus, Samson is absent from Quranic prophecy. His death is not remembered as holy, his vengeance not celebrated as divine. In Islam, the messengers of God leave legacies of wisdom and purity, not riddles and ruins. Their stories teach guidance, not paradox. Joseph endured betrayal but forgave. Muhammad endured persecution but prayed for his enemies. Moses endured rejection but pleaded for his people. To place Samson beside them would confuse the image of holiness. Islam guards prophecy from such contradiction, ensuring that believers do not mistake vengeance for virtue. This reveals a profound divide. Christianity embraces Samson's death as part of God's mysterious plan, declaring that God's power shines even through a ruined man's final prayer. Islam rejects such a story as prophetic. In Islam, God's messengers never end their lives crushed beneath idols, their final breath asking for revenge. They end their lives in submission, peace, and faith. The divergence cannot be softened. Either Samson's death is proof that God works through brokenness, or it is proof that Samson was not prophet at all. One vision sees redemption in paradox, the other sees holiness only in purity. The temple of Dagon fell, but the question rises, what does that fall mean? And so the interfaith challenge sharpens. If the Bible is true, then Samson's death shows us that God redeems even the most wasted life, that grace can turn ruins into victory. It declares that no fall is so deep that God cannot write his glory through it. But if the Quran is true, then Samson's death is evidence of his humanity, not his prophecy. It warns that a life led by lust ends in ruin, and that prophets are not such men. Which vision of God do we trust? A God who uses the broken to reveal his power, or a God who preserves his messengers so their lives are pure? Samson's final prayer echoes through both traditions. O Lord God, remember me. But the memory of God is told differently. In one story, it answers with collapsing walls. In the other, it never allows his prophets to need such an ending at all. The ruins of Gaza's temple lay heavy upon the city, the dust rising like smoke from a battlefield. Where once laughter had mocked a blind slave, silence now reigned. The lords of the Philistines were gone, their worshippers buried beneath stone, their idol humiliated. Samson's body was found among the rubble, broken yet victorious. His family came down from Israel to collect his remains, carrying him back to the tomb of his father Manoah. The story ends not with a crown, nor with songs of triumph, but with burial in the earth of his ancestors. 20 years he judged Israel, yet his greatest act came in death, not in life. The people mourned him, remembered his strength, and spoke of the day the temple of Dagon fell. His name became legend, his deeds remembered in Israel's songs and stories. Yet the taste of tragedy lingered, for the man who could have been a living deliverer became a fallen hero, whose death accomplished what his life had squandered. The Bible does not gloss over the paradox. It honors Samson as a judge, places his name among the faithful in Hebrews, yet records every failure with honesty. His lust, his folly, his wasted potential, all are told without veil. His strength was divine, but his heart was divided. His calling was great, but his choices were small. His vow was holy, but his desires were stronger. The Bible presents him not as model, but as warning. Yet in the same breath, it declares him a man of faith, for his final prayer turned to God, and God answered. Thus, Samson embodies the tension of biblical theology, that God redeems the broken, that faith can still rise in ruins, that weakness does not silence grace. His life speaks less of what man can accomplish and more of what God can salvage. He is both tragedy and triumph, failure and faith, a man whose story cannot be neatly resolved. The legacy of Samson in Christian thought is therefore twofold. On one side, he is remembered as caution, the man who wasted his consecration in lust and folly. On the other, he is remembered as hope, the man whose final breath still carried faith, whose God answered even a prayer mixed with revenge. He is the patron saint of paradox, proof that grace does not require perfection, that faith does not demand unbroken record. His story comforts the fallen, reminding them that God still hears, still uses, still redeems. Yet his story also warns the proud, showing that no gift, no strength, no calling can survive a life of compromise. Samson stands as both mirror and prophecy, his death the warning that wasted years cannot be reclaimed, his prayer the promise that mercy is never utterly withdrawn. In this paradox, many have found the strange comfort that God's plan is not undone by human ruin. In Islam, the paradox vanishes. The Quran does not present Samson as prophet, nor does it offer his death as example. Prophets in Islam are not remembered for vengeance, nor for collapse, nor for wasted potential. They are remembered for patience, for purity, for perseverance. Their deaths are not humiliations, but dignified transitions, their legacies not paradoxes, but clarity. The Quran's vision of prophecy does not allow such stories as Samson, for they would confuse guidance with failure, holiness with lust. Islam honors Joseph for his chastity, Moses for his endurance, Muhammad for his mercy. Each messenger is protected from sin, preserved as a model, a lantern unshaken by wind. To tell Samson's story in Islamic terms would be to remove him from prophecy entirely, to place him only as a figure of history, a man of strength, but not of message. His lust disqualifies him, his vengeance disowns him. Islam does not need Samson in its prophetic gallery, for its prophets must be pure. This contrast reveals two visions of how God works. In Christianity, Samson proves that God redeems broken vessels, that grace shines brightest in ruins, that weakness does not disqualify faith. His paradox is part of the beauty of God's mercy, showing that even lust and folly cannot stop divine purpose. In Islam, Samson proves only that strength without purity collapses, that lust leads to ruin, and that prophets must be shielded from such shame. His absence from prophecy is itself a message. Holiness is guarded, guidance is clear, the messengers are untainted. Where Christianity finds hope in paradox, Islam finds clarity in perfection. Both seek to glorify God, but they paint him in different light. One paints him as redeemer of failure, the other as protector from failure. One finds comfort in God's patience with weakness, the other in God's preservation from weakness. The interfaith challenge is sharp. If the Bible is true, then Samson's story offers hope to all who have fallen, declaring that even wasted lives can find redemption, that even final prayers can shake the pillars of despair. If the Quran is true, then Samson's story warns us that lust destroys and proves that he was never prophet, for God's messengers are not ruined by desire. Which vision do we follow? Do we believe that God works through paradox, or that he guards his messengers from paradox? Do we take comfort in the redemption of ruin, or in the preservation from ruin? Samson's death in Gaza forces the question: was it victory in tragedy, or tragedy unworthy of prophecy? Was it God's glory revealed in weakness, or man's weakness revealed outside of prophecy? The temple of Dagon fell, but the debate it raises stands still, challenging faith to decide what holiness means and what kind of God we worship. There is a silence in the Bible where thunder should be, a gap in the canon where curiosity grows restless. The story of the Watchers, those angels who descended upon the daughters of men, lives in fragments, echoes, and apocrypha. Genesis gives us only a few lines, brief and haunting. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives as they chose. From their union came giants, mighty men of renown. Then the flood came, and the Lord declared that his spirit would not always strive with man. It is a passage that reads like a whisper of something vast, a curtain drawn too quickly, leaving only glimpses of what lay behind. Later Jewish writings, like the Book of Enoch, expanded into legend: angels who lusted after women, who descended from heaven, who taught forbidden knowledge, sorcery, weapons, enchantments, astrology. They bore monstrous offspring, the Nephilim, who devoured the land with violence and sin. The flood, in this telling, was not merely judgment upon humanity, but also a cleansing of angelic rebellion. It is a tale of heaven bending toward earth in desire, and earth collapsing under the weight of divine betrayal. The fragments of scripture and the fullness of legend have fascinated generations. The Bible gives us enough to be unsettled, not enough to be certain. Who were these sons of God? Were they fallen angels? Were they rulers, kings, men of authority who took women by force? Were the Nephilim giants in body or giants in cruelty, their renown built on conquest? The ambiguity allows room for mystery, and mystery has bred interpretation. Some read Genesis as simple history, others as myth, others as parable. Yet the tone of the text is ominous. Whatever happened in those days, it provoked the flood. Whatever the identity of the sons of God and their offspring, the result was corruption so deep that God repented of making man. Violence filled the earth, wickedness stained every thought, and the solution was water that would cover mountains. The Watchers, in legend, become the cause of that corruption. The angels who abandoned heaven for lust, who abandoned duty for desire, who abandoned God for women. In the Book of Enoch, which influenced Jewish thought but never entered the biblical canon, the Watchers are named Azazel, Semjaza, and others, leaders of 200 angels who swore an oath to descend. They taught humanity secrets, war and weaponry, charms and spells, adornments and cosmetics, the cutting of roots and the reading of stars. They corrupted creation by sharing knowledge meant only for God. Their children, the giants, became destroyers of the earth, consuming not only animals but also men. When their hunger grew too great, they turned to bloodshed, and the cries of humanity rose to heaven. God judged the Watchers, binding them in chains, casting them into pits of darkness, awaiting the day of final judgment. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were slain by the flood, their spirits left to wander the earth as restless demons. It is a story of divine rebellion and cosmic punishment, a drama that explains not only the flood, but also the presence of evil spirits in the world. Yet the Bible itself does not preserve this tale in fullness. It hints, suggests, gestures toward the strange, but leaves the details in shadow. The New Testament briefly touches the echoes. Jude speaks of angels who did not keep their own domain but left their proper abode, whom God has kept in eternal chains under darkness. Peter speaks of angels who sinned, cast into gloomy pits to be held for judgment. These fragments sound like reflections of the Watcher's story, as if early Christians knew the tradition but kept it at the margins. They do not deny it, but they do not elaborate. The canon closes with mystery unresolved, a story half told, a warning without a full narrative. Perhaps the silence is deliberate, guarding readers from the allure of forbidden curiosity. Perhaps it is a reminder that not every tale of heaven belongs to Scripture, that not every myth is revelation. Yet the fascination remains. The Watchers stand as haunting figures at the edge of the biblical world, reminders that lust and rebellion can reach even the gates of heaven, and that judgment spares none who defy God. Islam approaches this silence differently. The Quran never speaks of angels who lusted after women, never tells of heavenly beings descending to earth in desire. Angels in Islam are created beings of light, who do not disobey God, who fulfill their commands without hesitation. They do not marry, do not lust, do not rebel. The Quran emphasizes that angels are pure, and rebellion belongs only to jinn or to Satan, who was not an angel but of the jinn. Thus, the story of the Watchers is absent. Where the Bible hints and legends elaborate, the Quran denies the premise altogether. Angels cannot fall in lust, cannot abandon heaven for women, cannot be chained for rebellion. They are messengers, guardians, servants, never traitors. To Islam, the Watcher's tale is distortion, myth mistaken for revelation. Corruption before the flood came not from angels but from men themselves. Violence was human, lust was human, rebellion was human. Judgment fell on mankind, not on angels. The Quran shields heaven from scandal, reserving sin for those who have choice, jinn and men. This distinction creates a tension. In the biblical world, the boundary between heaven and earth can blur, angels can fall, desire can corrupt even celestial beings. In the Islamic world, heaven is pure, its messengers blameless, and corruption arises only from creatures with will to disobey. Which vision is true? If the Watchers existed, then heaven itself is not safe from lust. If they did not, then the legends are human imagination projected upon the divine. If Genesis hints at angels in rebellion, then the Quran's denial demands explanation. If the Quran's purity is true, then the biblical fragments require reinterpretation. The interfaith challenge rises from the silence. Was the flood a cleansing of angelic corruption or only of human wickedness? Were demons born of fallen giants, or are they only jinn, created as a separate race? Did heaven once betray itself, or has heaven always remained pure? These questions linger at the edge of both traditions, unresolved, haunting, demanding an answer from those who read. The Watcher's story forces us to ask, what is the nature of angels? What is the nature of sin? What is the boundary of heaven? If angels can fall, then lust is deeper than humanity, rebellion wider than earth. If angels cannot fall, then humanity alone bears the weight of corruption, and heaven stands untouched. The Bible hints, Islam denies, and the Apocrypha elaborates. Between them, we are left with paradox, a story that may never be resolved. Yet in the tension, faith must decide what to believe. Either heaven has scars or it does not. Either angels once betrayed God or they never could. And whichever answer we choose shapes not only how we read Genesis, but how we understand holiness itself. Was paradise ever breached from within or only from without? Was lust so strong it reached heaven, or is heaven untouchable? The story of the Watchers asks, and both the Bible and the Quran reply in different tongues. The story of the Watchers, though absent in detail from the canon, lingered like a shadow in the imagination of ancient Israel. Genesis gave only its skeletal frame, but the bones were heavy enough to provoke centuries of wonder. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and whispers in apocalyptic literature all filled in the missing flesh. In these texts, the Watchers are portrayed not merely as lustful angels, but as corrupters of civilization. They descended to teach mankind secrets that twisted the order of creation. They introduced metallurgy, the forging of weapons that would turn brother against brother. They taught enchantments, poisons, and charms, arming humanity with dark arts that bound souls in fear. They revealed the movement of stars, not as guidance for navigation, but as systems of astrology that enslaved minds. Even the adornment of women, the use of cosmetics, jewelry, and dyes, is blamed upon them, small vanities that grew into the snare of lust. In these portrayals, the Watchers were midwives of human sin, accelerating wickedness until the world groaned under its weight. The Nephilim, their offspring, became terrors upon the earth. Some texts describe them as giants so tall that their feet brushed mountains, others as tyrants whose cruelty matched their stature. They devoured crops, slaughtered animals, and even turned against mankind, eating flesh and drinking blood. Violence multiplied like wildfire, filling the land until the cries of the oppressed rose to heaven. The blood of the innocent demanded judgment, and the flood was God's answer. The waters came not only to wash away human corruption, but to destroy the monstrous children of heaven and earth. Thus, in these apocryphal accounts, the Watchers explain why sin reached such depths, why the flood was inevitable, why demons linger after the destruction of giants. The ruined world was not merely human ruin, but angelic rebellion spilling into creation. The Bible, however, withholds these details. It speaks only briefly. The sons of God took wives, the Nephilim were born, the world grew violent, the flood came. It is concise, restrained, as if warning readers not to chase the forbidden tales too far. Yet later echoes in Jude and Peter suggest that early Christians were familiar with the Enochic traditions. Angels bound in chains, awaiting judgment, are mentioned almost in passing, as though their existence was common knowledge but not central to faith. The inspired text leaves us with fragments, enough to know that heaven's rebellion was punished, but not enough to dwell on the myths that had grown around it. The silence may itself be the message. Some knowledge is not for men, some mysteries remain closed, and the fascination with rebellion can itself become temptation. Still, the shadow of the Watchers remains one of the most haunting mysteries in biblical thought. In Islam, the silence becomes denial. The Quran insists upon a different portrait of angels, beings created from light, incapable of disobedience, devoted entirely to the command of God. When God commands, they obey without hesitation. They do not lust, they do not rebel, they do not take wives, they do not father children. The story of lustful angels producing giants is therefore rejected as myth. Instead, Islam attributes corruption before the flood to human arrogance and to the whispers of Iblis, the enemy who tempts but does not force. Jinn are the only beings besides men with free will, capable of obedience or rebellion. It is through them, not angels, that dark knowledge, sorcery, and whispers of evil enter the world. Thus, the Quran preserves heaven's purity. Angels are guardians and messengers, never corrupters. When they interact with humanity, it is to guide, not to defile. To Islam, The Watcher's tale is slander against heaven, a distortion that confuses angels with the rebellious jinn. This Islamic vision radically reframes the flood. The Quran tells of Noah's call, his rejection, the flood as judgment upon a stubborn people. It does not mention giants or angelic offspring. The wickedness judged was human wickedness, idolatry, pride, denial of God's messenger. There is no cosmic rebellion from heaven, only human arrogance upon earth. The Quran thereby strips the story of its mythic strangeness, presenting instead a sober narrative. God sent a prophet, the people disbelieved, the flood destroyed them, Noah was saved. No angels in chains, no Nephilim, no forbidden knowledge taught by heavenly beings. The story becomes clearer but also narrower. It emphasizes responsibility, not mystery. Humanity fell by its own choices, not by corruption imported from heaven. For Islam, this clarity protects the believer from confusion. Angels are always holy, men are accountable, God's judgment is always just. Yet the interfaith challenge is unavoidable. If the Bible's fragments and Jewish traditions are true, then heaven itself was once touched by lust, angels capable of falling, creation itself corrupted by their rebellion. But if the Quran is true, then these traditions are myths, distortions of the truth, inventions of men fascinated with forbidden tales. Which vision is to be trusted? Do we accept that angels can fall in lust, or do we hold that they never could? Do we believe that demons are the spirits of slain giants, or that they are jinn, created separately from the beginning? Do we interpret the flood as a cosmic cleansing of both men and fallen angels, or as a sober punishment upon men alone? The answers divide the two faiths, sharpening the question of revelation itself. Which book preserves the truth? Which one guards us from myth? Which one reveals the real nature of heaven and earth? Watchers stand, then, as a line of controversy. In one tradition, they explain the flood, the origin of demons, the corruption of mankind. In the other, they do not exist, their tale rejected as slander against the purity of heaven. If the Bible's hints are true, then the Quran's denial leaves something missing. If the Quran's clarity is true, then the Bible's fragments reflect corrupted memory, myth mistaken for revelation. The challenge is not only about angels, but about God himself. Would he allow his messengers to fall into lust, or would he preserve them forever pure? Would he permit heaven to betray itself, or is heaven untouchable? The answer shapes our understanding of holiness, judgment, and revelation. Between the watchers of Genesis and the angels of the Quran lies a canyon, and faith must decide which voice to follow. Was the world once shattered by angelic lust, or only by human pride? The story waits for us to answer. The story of the Watchers closes not with peace but with unease. In the apocryphal accounts, the angels who descended are bound in chains beneath the earth, waiting for the day of judgment. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are slain in the flood, yet their spirits linger as restless demons, roaming the earth, whispering temptation, sowing fear. This, according to those traditions, explains the presence of evil spirits throughout history, why men fear shadows, why possession and sorcery persist. Heaven itself had birthed corruption, and though the flood washed the earth, it could not erase the stain entirely. Thus, the world lives with scars of angelic rebellion. The Bible itself is quieter, offering only echoes, angels in chains, reserved for judgment, spirits of disobedience that trouble mankind. It gives just enough to suggest that something dark remains unfinished, that rebellion did not end with the flood, but lingers at the edges of creation. The silence is haunting. It asks the reader to wonder what lies beyond the veil, what powers still move unseen, what judgment still waits. The Watcher's legacy therefore became more than myth, it became explanation. Why is the world so broken? Why does evil feel older than humanity itself? Why do men fall so easily into violence and lust? The tale of heavenly rebellion offers an answer. Sin is not only human but cosmic, its roots stretching into heaven itself. The flood destroyed bodies but not spirits, and those spirits continue to trouble mankind. The giants may be gone, but their shadows remain. In Christian thought, these fragments mingle with the broader theme of spiritual warfare. Paul writes of rulers, authorities, powers of darkness, spiritual forces in heavenly places. Though he does not name them as Nephilim, the imagery resonates. Unseen powers, once exalted, now fallen, battling against the people of God. The Watcher's tale offers a backdrop to this cosmic conflict, a story that frames the brokenness of the world as more than human weakness, but as part of an older war between heaven and rebellion. Yet the Bible does not allow us to rest in myth. It directs us not to curiosity about chains and demons, but to faith in God's sovereignty. The silence may itself be intentional, preventing fascination from becoming obsession. Scripture closes the door to endless speculation, reminding believers that victory lies not in knowing the origins of demons, but in trusting the Lord who reigns above them. The Watchers remain shadows, not center stage. The flood remains judgment upon men, not merely upon angels. The Bible gives fragments but withholds the rest, drawing a line between what is revealed and what is hidden. This balance both unsettles and secures. It unsettles because questions remain unanswered. It secures because God's sovereignty is never in doubt. The fragments remind us of mystery, but the message remains. God judged wickedness, preserved his people, and will one day finish what was begun. In Islam, the legacy is erased. There are no chains of angels beneath the earth, no restless spirits of giants haunting the world. The Quran explains the unseen differently. Jinn, created from smokeless fire, share the world with mankind. Some believe, some disbelieve, some whisper temptation, some live in peace. Satan himself is a jinn who disobeyed, not an angel who fell. This preserves heaven's holiness. Angels remain sinless, jinn bear responsibility, men face temptation, and God alone is sovereign. The corruption before Noah's flood is not blamed on heavenly lust, but on human arrogance and demonic whispers. The flood destroys only men and their wickedness, not hybrid giants or angelic offspring. Evil spirits are explained as jinn, not Nephilim. The story is clearer, simpler, stripped of mythic strangeness. It emphasizes accountability. Mankind fell because of mankind, not because of angels who betrayed their station. For Islam, the story of the Watchers is unnecessary and misleading, a distortion that confuses the roles of angels and jinn, a myth that weakens the clarity of God's truth. This difference is not small. It changes how each faith sees holiness, judgment, and the unseen. If angels can fall, then heaven itself has cracks. If angels cannot fall, then heaven is pure, and corruption belongs only to creatures with free will. If demons are the spirits of slain giants, then evil is the ghost of heaven's betrayal. If demons are jinn, then evil is simply the product of free creatures choosing disobedience. The divergence shapes how we see the world itself. Christianity allows mystery, paradox, fragments that hint at cosmic rebellion. Islam removes the myth, presenting clarity and purity. Both declare God sovereign, but they draw different portraits of his creation. One says even angels fell, the other says angels never could. The interfaith challenge, then, is piercing. If the Bible is true, then heaven itself once knew lust, rebellion, and ruin, and the world is haunted by its scars. If the Quran is true, then such tales are distortions, slanders against heaven, myths mistaken for revelation. Which story do we trust? Do we believe that angels once betrayed God, or that they never could? Do we accept that evil spirits are born of hybrid giants drowned in the flood, or that they are simply jinn created from the beginning? Do we see the flood as cosmic cleansing of angelic corruption, or as human judgment alone? The two stories cannot both be true. Either the Bible preserves fragments of a forbidden tale, or the Quran preserves purity against myth. The Watchers stand as test, either shadows of truth lost from canon, or shadows of falsehood masquerading as revelation. Between them lies the decision of faith. Did heaven ever fall in lust, or has heaven always remained pure? When the dust of ancient ages settles, the tale of the Watchers still refuses to be silent. In the memory of those who pondered the mysteries of Genesis, their rebellion became a kind of explanation for why humanity is never at peace, why violence feels older than nations, why temptation gnaws even at the most devout. It is as though the story insists that sin is not merely a flaw in human flesh, but a wound in the very fabric of creation, a wound inflicted when heaven itself reached downward in betrayal. The apocryphal texts portray it vividly, angels swearing oaths upon Mount Hermon, descending with luminous power, only to be consumed by desire. Their descent becomes a mirror of man's own fall, a cosmic reenactment of Eden's whisper. And from that union of heaven's treachery with earth's weakness came creatures neither wholly human nor wholly divine, symbols of corruption made flesh. The giants stride across the ancient imagination as reminders that forbidden unions yield monstrous offspring, that rebellion against God does not create beauty but distortion. This vision lingers in Jewish and Christian traditions as both fascination and warning. The fascination lies in the strangeness of the tale, its cosmic drama of heaven and earth colliding. The warning lies in its moral. Desire unrestrained leads not to blessing but to ruin. The Watchers thought they could descend without consequence, that their glory would remain intact. Instead, they found themselves chained, their children destroyed, their names cursed. The story becomes a caution not merely against lust, but against presumption, the arrogance of stepping beyond the boundary God has set. It declares that holiness is not to be trifled with, that the order of creation is sacred, and that to blur heaven and earth is to invite judgment. This, at least, is how the fragments of Scripture and the Apocrypha combine in the memory of faith. Yet the Bible itself leaves their fate shrouded in silence. Angels who sinned, kept in chains of darkness, waiting for judgment. That is all Jude and Peter allow us to know. They do not describe the lust, they do not name the offspring, they do not recount the teachings of sorcery. They leave the tale skeletal, almost reluctant. The restraint itself may be the message. Curiosity about rebellion can become dangerous. The more one peers into darkness, the more it entices. Scripture gives only enough to say, yes, there was rebellion. Yes, there was judgment. No, you do not need to know more. The Watchers fade into the background, their story unfinished, their details hidden. What matters is not the drama of angels, but the sovereignty of God, who judges and who saves. Even when fragments of Enoch echo through the New Testament, the canon keeps its distance, careful not to enshrine what was never meant as foundation. The silence teaches humility. We are not told all because we are not meant to chase every mystery. Islam, however, closes the door entirely. In the Quran, angels are flawless in their obedience. They bow when commanded, they act without hesitation, they never rebel. The notion that heavenly beings could lust after women is unthinkable. Angels are not given desire, not given families, not given the ability to transgress. The only figure who rebelled was Iblis, and he was of the jinn, not of the angels. In this clarity, Islam defends heaven's purity from all scandal. If corruption exists, it flows from jinn and from men, not from the servants of God. Evil spirits are explained not as restless ghosts of drowned giants, but as disbelieving jinn. Sorcery, whispers, temptations, they belong to creatures who, like humans, have free will. Heaven remains unbroken, unsullied, untouched. In this way, Islam removes the mythic strangeness that haunts the biblical fragments. There are no chained angels beneath the earth. There are no hybrid offspring roaming the ancient world. There is only humanity, accountable for its sins, and jinn, accountable for theirs. This divide is stark. The biblical world hints that heaven itself once bent under the weight of desire, while the Quran declares heaven unshaken. The difference shapes not only angelology but theology itself. If angels can fall, then even the highest realms of creation are vulnerable. If angels cannot fall, then heaven remains a fortress of purity, and corruption is confined to those created with choice. Which vision is true? The answer determines how we understand holiness itself. Is holiness something fragile, able to fracture under temptation, or is holiness something absolute, preserved by God beyond all possibility of breach? The Bible's fragments and the Apocrypha suggest the former. Islam insists on the latter. Between them lies a canyon wide enough to divide entire worldviews. And here the interfaith challenge sharpens to its point. If the Bible's fragments are true, then the Quran's denial removes part of history, erases part of revelation, simplifies what was complex. If the Quran's clarity is true, then the Bible's hints are distortions, either remnants of myth or misreadings of cryptic verses. Both cannot stand together. One tells us that heaven once betrayed itself, the other tells us that heaven never could. One paints angels as capable of lust, the other insists angels are forever pure. One explains demons as the restless spirits of monstrous hybrids, the other as a race created separately by God. Faith must decide which portrait is real. Do we believe in angels chained in darkness for their rebellion, or do we believe that no such rebellion ever happened? Do we accept that heaven itself has scars, or do we hold that heaven has always remained whole? The Watcher's tale, whether real or imagined, refuses to be neutral. It forces us to wrestle with the nature of holiness, the origin of evil, the mystery of judgment. Was the flood a cosmic cleansing of angelic corruption, or a human judgment alone? Are we haunted by the ghosts of heavenly betrayal, or only tempted by the whispers of jinn? Do we live in a universe where even angels can fall, or one where angels forever obey? The two scriptures call us in opposite directions, each demanding trust, each offering a different picture of God's creation. And at the heart of the question lies not merely angels, but God himself. What kind of creator do we believe in? One who allows his highest servants to stumble, or one who preserves them spotless? One who redeems through paradox and fragments, or one who guards through clarity and protection? The ruins of the Watcher's story leave us with a choice that shapes not only our theology, but our entire vision of heaven and earth.